I'm the chair of the Decommissioning Oversight Board, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. I want to thank our host, Supervisor Becker, and I want to turn it over to our host to say a few introduction remarks.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here at the Town of Cortland. Dinner was provided by the Town of Cortland as well as through Teresa Knickerbocker, the mayor of the Village of Buchanan. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope people are zooming in from home. Today is Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. So we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. If everyone could please rise.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Supervisor Becker. And thank you very much for providing dinner, and thank you to Mayor Knickerbocker as well. Very nice of you. Tonight we are very pleased to be joined by our colleagues at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But before we do, let's just go through and go through some meeting logistics. Next slide, please. Thank you. So very important for all the DOB members to always speak into the mic. That way, all of our remarks will be recorded on our video recording, and all of our virtual participants can hear us. All of the virtual panelists who are part of the DOB are muted upon entry, so keep that in mind when it's your turn to speak. Staff will unmute the public participants when it's your turn to speak during the public statement portion of the meeting. For the Zoom participants, please reserve the chat feature for reporting technical issues. Thank you. Next slide. Getting some feedback on the virtual mic. I thought we were all muted upon entry, but apparently not. Important that if folks are not on mute, to go ahead and mute if you're attending virtually. Thank you. I'd like to now do a roll call. Supervisor Becker?
Here.
Mayor Knickerbocker, I don't think will be joining us. Superintendent Hochreiter?
Here.
Deputy Commissioner for Emergency Services, Susan Spear.
Here.
Assemblywoman Sandy Galiff.
Here.
John Sipos from Department of Public Service.
Here.
Tom Kazmarek from Department of Public Service, attending virtually. Tom? We'll come back to Tom. Cliff Chapin from Department of Public Service.
Here. Here.
Dan Bendel from DEC. Virtually.
Here.
Jeff Goynup from Department of Labor.
Here.
Thank you, Jeff. Mark Pattison, Department of State.
Here.
Mark Massaroni, Department of Tax and Finance.
Here.
Jennifer Waka, Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services.
Here.
Tom Scaglione from Empire State Development.
Good evening here.
Thanks, Tom. Anthony Hill from New York Power Authority, or Joe Leary.
Here.
Hi. Do you want to join us? Is there, maybe go to the front? Thank you. Elise Peterson from NYSERDA.
Here.
And our technical experts, we have Dave Lockbaum, our independent nuclear expert, virtually.
Here in Chattanooga.
Hi, Dave. Richard Webster from Riverkeeper.
Yep, here.
Great. Now our labor representatives, Al Lipitor.
Here.
Thanks, Al. Bill Smith.
Here.
And Tom Carey.
Here.
Thank you, guys. Okay. Did I miss anyone on the DOB? Okay.
I'm representing.
I'm sorry,
Senator Pete
Tito.
Harkin.
Thank you very much.
Tito Davila.
Tito's here on behalf of Senator Harkin. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge Rich Baroni from Holtec. Rich?
Here.
And now for our guest presenters. Anthony Dimitriadis from NRC. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you.
Brianna DeBoer from NRC. Welcome. And they are joined by several of their colleagues in the audience who may also assist during the Q&A. Attending virtually are some of our colleagues from the Department of Energy, Erica Bickford. Erica?
Hello.
And Steve Maharis. Steve?
Here.
Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much. With that, next slide, please. So this is our agenda for this evening. We have planned to start with presentations from the NRC and the DOE. We will then turn to Q&A among the DOB members for discussion with our federal representatives. We will also then have time for public statements from the public, and we have several who have pre-registered, both virtually and in person. Following the public statement portion of the meeting, we will turn to some business of the Indian Point Task Force with some updates, and then we will adjourn. So with that, oh, and before I get started, we are here with our federal partners. We also have with us representatives from our federal offices, and Senator Gillibrand's office is represented, as well as Senator Schumer's virtually. So thank you for being in attendance as well. So without further ado, let's turn to our first presentation on spent fuel management from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I'll turn it over to Anthony Dimitriadis and Brianna DeBoer. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anthony Dimitriadis, and I'm from NRC Region 1. I want to take a little bit of time to talk a little bit about what the NRC does and doesn't do, just for a minute. So the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is a federal agency. It's an independent agency with 5 commissioners. We have our headquarters office in Rockville, Maryland, and we have 4 regional offices in Philadelphia, Atlanta, Chicago, and Dallas, actually Arlington. And so we are from Region 1 in outside of Philadelphia. Actually, it's in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. And we also have some colleagues here from our headquarters office, and also some folks online, so that we can answer some questions that may be outside our special area of specialty. So we have about 15 slides to go over. We wanted to take about 15, 20 minutes to go over those. We didn't want to bore you with, PowerPoint, so we just wanted to go through a little bit of what spent fuel is, dry cask storage, and that way we don't bore you to tears. And then we want to really get to your questions that you may have. Okay? So my name is Anthony Dimitriadis. With me I have Brianna DeBoer, who's a senior health physicist. She's one of our senior inspectors that relates to ISFSI, Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation. And are the slides on, or are we going to?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay. This slide actually shows an image of a portion of the ISFSI pad at Indian Point. So we didn't want to give you a canned presentation with just generic things. We wanted to focus on the interests that you have about Indian Point. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to go over some of the basics of an ISFSI. For some of you who know what an ISFSI is, this will be a review. We didn't want to insult your intelligence, but for others it would be an introduction if you have a limited knowledge of them, and I'm speaking for those who may not have had really an introduction. So a dry cask storage system is basically a cylindrically shaped cask that is designed to store spent nuclear fuel in a dry configuration. I can't stress that enough, that it's a dry configuration. Basically, a dry cask storage system is a cylinder that operators lower into a spent fuel pool and fill with spent fuel. When loading of the fuel into the cask is completed, they raise the cask, drain it, they dry it, before sealing it and placing it outdoors on a concrete pad. There are many varieties of spent fuel storage casks, but of those, they all need to do the following. They need to maintain confinement of the spent fuel. They need to prevent nuclear fission, the chain reaction that allows the reactor to produce heat. They must provide radiation shielding, maintain the ability to retrieve the spent fuel if necessary, and resist earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, temperature extremes, and other scenarios. Casks come in different sizes. They are tall enough to hold spent fuel, which can be up to about 14 feet long, and they can weigh up to about 150 to 200 tons, basically as much as about 50 mid-sized cars. I'm trying to give you a sense of scale here for those of you who may not already know these. Plants may need a special crane that can handle heavy loads to be able to lift a loaded cask full of water and fuel out of the pool for drying. There's a reason I bring that up, because Indian Point obviously is undergoing some crane installations in the next couple of months. After casks are dried, robotic equipment is used to seal them closed to keep doses to workers as low as possible. So they're welded closed. Two basic designs are in wide use today. Welded canister-based systems feature an inner steel canister that contains the fuel surrounded by 3 feet or more of steel and concrete. The canisters may be oriented vertically or horizontally. In this case, it's vertical. And in bolted cask systems, there is no inner canister, which is a different design. Next slide, please. So I thought that we would include this slide here, which shows a cutaway of a spent fuel storage cask. This is an image of a cutaway, and it's, as you could see, it's surrounded by by steel and a thick concrete shielding. I bring this up because there's been some questions or concerns about thin-walled casks. It's true that it's on the inside, if you could see that, there is a half-inch steel. However, there's let me get back to that in a minute. When the company designs the cask, it must provide an evaluation that shows the system will be strong and stable enough to perform its safety functions even after experiencing a load, such as if the cask were to be dropped. NRC reviewers examine the structural design and analysis of the system under all credible loads and normal conditions. That is, planned operations and environmental conditions that can be expected to occur often during storage. They also look at accidents, natural events, and conditions that can be expected to occur from time to time, but not regularly. The NRC review looks at whether the cask designer evaluated the proper loading conditions. It will also ensure the designer evaluated the system's response to those loads accurately and completely. Our reviewers must verify whether the resulting stresses in the material meet the acceptance criteria and the appropriate code. And when I say the code, I mean materials code and various other codes that our tech reviewers use. These cases are analyzed to determine the stresses placed on the material used to construct the cask system. To be conservative, the NRC and the designers overestimate loads and underestimate material strength. This is part of the conservative assumptions that we use in our regulatory oversight on a regular basis. Doing this enhances the NRC's assurance that the design is adequate. Next slide, please. So casks, we talked about casks coming in different sizes. They're all tall enough to hold the spent fuel, like I said, and they can weigh up to 150 to 200 tons. As I mentioned before, plants may need a special crane that can handle such heavy loads to be able to lift a loaded cask full of fuel and water out of the pool for drying. After they're dry, the casks are closed and sealed, that is, they're welded on the top, by robotic equipment, and that is done to keep the doses to workers as low as possible. ISFSIs, the independent spent fuel storage installations, which we consider these systems, have been used since 1986 in a very safe manner. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that no radiation release affecting the public or contaminating the environment. That's what I mean by that. Next slide, please. So plants use special transporters to move the loaded cask outdoors to where it will be stored on the ISFSI concrete pad. At that point, the radioactivity from the cask must be less than 25 millirem per year at the site boundary. That means that the highest dose allowed to someone standing at the fence for a full year is about the dose someone would receive from cosmic radiation going around the world in an airplane. The actual dose at the site boundary is typically much lower. And I wanted to include these pictures to give you a sense of scale with the person next to it. As you could see that, how big and robust these casks and the transporters are. Because they're designed to transport a very heavy load, as you can imagine. Next slide, please. So this is an image of a construction of an ISFSI pad, not at Indian Point, at another site, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what goes into constructing an ISFSI pad to be able to withstand the loads here. As you could see in these pictures, the preparation of an ISFSI pad is quite significant. You can see the amount of rebar that is used to build the ISFSI pad. It is quite strong and is able to withstand the loads required for storage. The company that builds these concrete pads collects samples from the pads, and the samples are sent to an independent laboratory where they do what's called a 7-day and a 28-day compression tests. This is civil engineering material science that they use that's performed to verify that the certain acceptance criteria are met for the storage duration period with such heavy loads. Next slide, please. So this slide is regarding aging management. There's been questions about what happens over the years. Aging management considers the possible aging mechanisms and effects that could affect safety functions of a dry storage system. Safety functions include confinement, structural integrity, heat removal, shielding, criticality control, retrievability. Aging mechanisms and effects are evaluated using dry storage design information, component safety functions, component materials, and operating environments. Aging effects from metals and alloys include corrosion, stress corrosion cracking, embrittlement, and loss of ductility and loss of strength. Time-limited aging analysis, calculation using dry storage system design basis is used, for example, fatigue. And the aging management program also deals with specific activities to detect or prevent aging effects and corrective actions when required, inspections and testing. The pictures on the left involves an inspection of a dry storage system canister at Maine Yankee. And in the middle is a robotic crawler for inspection of canisters and interior of a shielding overpack. It can be equipped with a variety of non-destructive examination tools, that robot that you could see. And on the right is a new Reg 2214 that describes our managing aging processes and storage report. It was issued in 2019 through review of aging mechanisms and effects of dry storage system designs and materials, and it includes examples of aging management programs. Next slide, please. So we wanted to include this slide about high burnup fuel. There's been some questions that we got about this. So most sites also have some fuel that is called high burnup fuel. So what is that exactly? To understand burnup, it helps to know more about the uranium that fuels a reactor. Before it is made into fuel, uranium is processed to increase the concentration of atoms that can split in a controlled chain reaction in the reactor. The atoms release energy as they split. This energy produces the heat that is turned into electricity. In general, the higher the concentration of those atoms, the longer the fuel can sustain a chain reaction. And the longer the fuel remains in the reactor, the higher the burnup. I hope that just provide a little basic, primer on what high burnup fuel really covers. In other words, burnup is a way to measure how much uranium is burned in the reactor. It's the amount of energy produced by the uranium. Burnup is expressed in what we call gigawatt days per metric ton of uranium. Now, as utilities are able to get more power out of their fuel before replacing it, burnup can be over what we call 45 gigawatt days per metric ton of uranium. This means they can operate longer between refueling outages, 18 months, 24 months, things like that. It also means they use less fuel. Operating experience since dry storage began in 1986, as I mentioned before, in short-term tests show that both low and high burnup spent fuel can be stored and transported safely. The NRC has sponsored testing at Oak Ridge National Laboratory on high burnup fuel under stresses greater than the loads expected during normal storage and transport. And we continue to gather information on this subject to ensure valuable configuration of our program. Next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Brianna to cover the rest of the slides.
Good evening. Again, I'm Brianna DeBoer. I'm a senior SBC inspector out of the NRC Region 1 office. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about the regional inspection program now. NRC performs inspections to ensure SBCs meet NRC regulations during their construction and their operation. These inspections cover design and construction of the pad, dry runs, which are performed without spent fuel, actual cask loading, and that includes loading of spent fuel, processing and drying of the can, welding the cask shut, and transporting the cask to the pad. And then routine monitoring inspections of the casks. And this includes inspections of the casks that are already loaded on the pad, the concrete pad itself, and the licensee's program. NRC routine monitoring inspections continue as long as fuel is on site. Pictured here is one of our inspectors along with the licensee representative doing a walk down during a routine inspection. And on the right, you can see the VCT, which is the vertical cask transporter, getting set up to lift the high storm prior to its movement to its location on the ISVC pad. The workers in these pictures provide a good size comparison for scale. Our inspectors have conducted many inspections of ISVC programs over the years. The spent fuel inspection program remains robust and continues to assure that risk-informed safety focus areas and the inspection focus is designed to effectively monitor licensee performance. Next slide, please.
Can you get closer to the microphone?
Yeah, sorry. Better? Hello? Better? No?
Leave it to you.
Better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. Everybody can hear me? Okay. As I just touched upon, the regional inspection program involves our inspectors examining and observing various phases of the evolution before spent nuclear fuel is moved. And these phases are called dry runs. There are about 4 dry runs that our staff inspect that include the following activities: fuel movement, drying and processing of the cask, welding, and transporting the cask. Our staff conduct on-site inspections during the dry run evolution to ensure that the work is carefully planned and carefully executed. They are completed in addition to the on-site inspections conducted during actual loading of spent nuclear fuel. The picture on the left captured an NRC inspector during a welding dry run at Holtec's Camden facility in New Jersey back in March of 2020. He is independently observing a mock-up of a multi-purpose canister. Here, an evaluator is performing a temperature check of the MPC lid weld prior to starting the liquid dye-penetrant test. That's the non-destructive examination that they do of the weld after the weld is complete. The picture on the right captured another NRC inspector during a drying and processing dry run, also at the Camden facility. Next slide, please. ISVC pads are present at operating reactor sites, at sites that are undergoing active decommissioning, and such as Indian Point, and at sites that have completed decommissioning a long time ago, such as Maine Yankee, Yankee Row, and Connecticut Yankee. ISVC pads are secured with fences and various security features as shown in this slide. Without getting into details about security that could aid potential adversaries, I can say this. The ISVC pads have fences, detection equipment, alarms, assessment, and armed response forces. Whether the pad is at an operating reactor site, an actively decommissioning site, or an independent site that has long since completed its decommissioning activities, there is security around it 24/7. This security will be present as long as the fuel is on site. Next slide, please. Emergency planning is required at ISVC sites. The risks associated with a site that is shut down and is in decommissioning are significantly reduced than those of an operating reactor site. Therefore, the emergency planning for a permanently shut down site, although required, is different than that of an operating site. This is reflective of the greatly reduced risks associated with the decommissioning facility. This is the reason that licensees request changes to their emergency plans. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about ISFACs in general, and now we're going to cover a little bit about the ISFAC at Indian Point. So the picture you see here is a picture of the ISFAC pad at Indian Point, taken when the first high storm was being moved to the second pad that's newly poured earlier this year. In the background, you can still see pad number 1. Currently, as of last week, Indian Point currently stores 70 high storm 100s. 5 of those contain Unit 1 fuel, 47 casks contain Unit 2 fuel, and 18 casks contain Unit 3 fuel. Inside each of these high storms is a multi-purpose canister that holds 32 fuel assemblies. When all the fuel has been moved to the site expects there to be a total of 127 high storms loaded on these 2 pads. Next slide, please. So just to summarize what Tony and I have talked about, as part of our program, we continue to inspect ISFACs for safety and security as long as fuel is at that site. Further, ISFACs remain robust and are secured around the clock 24/7. And lastly, the NRC staff will continue to monitor the licensee's aging management program. And next slide, we're going to open it up for questions now.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
I want to call on Richard Webster, who solicited some questions from the community. I think as NRC understands, there's a very active community here with many individuals who've been working on nuclear policy and Indian Point matters for many years. And so we have a very active community that has assisted us as a Decommissioning Oversight Board. And they have several questions, I think, that they've provided to Dave. I'm sorry, Richard Webster, and Dave Lockbaum may have some questions as well, but I want to turn it first to Richard.
All right, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I have a few questions. A couple actually maybe I'll just do the ones directly related to the presentation first. Sure. And then move on to the ones that we had pre-prepared. Because the presentation, it's kind of an awkward setup because I can't quite look at both.
Do you want to just, if you'd like, you could go up to the podium to pose the questions. That way you're facing.
But then I've got my back to the audience.
Okay.
Let me do it this way.
Okay, there you go.
Right. Okay. So just picking up on the presentation, let me just start off at the back end. You said that the emergency management plan for the IFCC is different to the operating reactor. Can you just give us some details on how that works?
Sure. So when the plant is operating, the risks associated with an operating plant are very different than a shutdown plant. Right. So that's what we mean.
But what's the difference in the emergency management plan?
Well, there's many differences. One, it has to do with what levels of emergencies would be. For a shutdown plant with only ISFACs, the highest level would be an alert, as opposed to a site area emergency and a general emergency.
Right, so there's no evacuation planning, for example.
I'm sorry?
So, for example, there's no evacuation plan.
Correct. The risks for an evacuation are zero almost. I mean, it's not
just to be clear, I think I'm trying to elucidate some information for the public, and I think the public, hearing the risks are lower is one thing, but I think the public want to hear the actual concrete differences between what's required during operation and what's required just for the IFCC. For example, there are bus stops all around here that say Indian Point Emergency Management or Indian Point Evacuation Route or something. Can we assume those will not be operational?
I'd have to ask for somebody from our headquarters office to see if they can adjust that, to answer that.
Are they available?
Mike Norris, are you available?
Hi, Mike. I think we see you, but you may still be on mute.
Mike, you seem to be muted, unmuted on Zoom. It may be on your personal end.
Okay, is this any better?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. My name is Mike Norris. I'm a senior emergency preparedness specialist at NRC headquarters. And when the plant is in operation, it, as Tony alluded to, it has, emergency action levels and classification levels go up to a general emergency, which does bring into play the off-site, fully formal radiological emergency preparedness plan, which is, for all intents and purposes, it's inspected by FEMA. It's under FEMA's oversight. The NRC, we have the oversight on site. FEMA has the oversight for off-site. As the plant goes into decommissioning and the risk of the accidents goes down and the source terms also go down and the potential releases off-site also goes down, the need for the formal radiological emergency preparedness plan off-site is no longer needed. And you have to realize that that plan is in place to have predetermined protective actions for the public that can be initiated in a very short period of time. It's predetermined. Everything is already set up with the protective action recommendations that the licensee makes to the state and the county, and that those state and county implement. So your evacuation, things like the buses for the transient dependent populations, the schools for reception centers, all that is gone based on the reduced risk of just a spent fuel pool. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. So is all of these requirements for emergency planning already in the code, in the CFR?
Yes, currently the regulations for operating reactor power plants are the same. The regulations don't really allow for, they don't take into consideration decommissioning. So the process that we have to use is the licensee will request relief from the regulations that would be no longer applicable through the exemption process. And the NRC, based on its analysis of the design basis accident, the seismic evaluations of the spent fuel, the accidents related to any, there's a number of things, but there's basically, there's no release to the off-site that would exceed the Environmental Protection Agency protective action guides at the site boundary. We would approve these requested exemptions and basically take it down the regulations for the operating plant that's going into decommissioning to the same level of emergency planning that the standalone independent spent fuel storage installations like Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, and Yankee Row have. So it basically drops those regulations down to that. And we've been using that process since the 90s.
So there's something I don't understand though, because if the standalone IFTCs have a codified requirement for emergency planning, right?
Well,
why does the licensee need exemptions?
When you say the standalone ISFCs, it depends on how they're licensed. Part 72, which is the regulations for independent spent fuel storage, has emergency planning requirements, but those emergency planning requirements are applicable to.
Oh, Mike, you've been mute. Mike, you went back on mute somehow.
Okay, am I good?
Yeah, we lost you at part 72 has emergency regs.
Okay,
Yep.
Part 72 has emergency planning regulations for ISFCs that are either wet or dry, because there is a wet storage ISFC in Illinois, that are specific to a specific licensed ISFC. Most power reactors have general licensed ISFCs. The regulations in Part 72 allow for a general license ISFC. And in those cases, they use the Part 50 emergency plan regulations. So that's why we have to do exemptions to bring the regulations down in alignment with the Part 72 regulations for a specific license ISFC. It's kind of complicated, I guess.
Yeah, what can I say? I find on Planet NRC things often get complicated, so this is what we're left with. Oh well, thanks for those answers. That was very useful. So, next question. You mentioned security, Brianna, I think. My understanding is that the practice drills for security during operation actually have a force-on-force practice, and that goes away during once the fuel is out of the spent fuel pool. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And why?
Because the risks are much different, very lower.
The risk of what?
The risks of certain design basis threat risks, which I won't get into in a public forum, the risks are very different and much significantly lower. That's why.
Let me say I find that hard to understand, because I wouldn't have thought that it would be any harder to storm an IFSC than storm a operating plant. The consequences of that might be different, but the actual chance of that seems to be similar.
No, that's incorrect. When you have an operating plant, you have a number of areas and certain systems that have to be in place. When the plant is shut down and the fuel is removed from the reactor vessel and it's in the spent fuel pool or in the ISFC pad, the risks are very different and the attack vectors are very different. So
right, it's the word risk that I'm worried about here, because risk in my mind, right, is frequency times consequence, right?
Yes.
And I recognize that for the operating reactor, the consequence could be higher. But is the initiating likelihood, or the likelihood of the initiating event higher?
I'm not sure what you're asking, but
I mean, in other words, a successful attack, let's assume the attacker has a goal to achieve entry and then to achieve some sort of either movement or release. Is that probability higher or lower for an IFSC versus an operating reactor?
higher low for success, you mean?
Yeah.
It's much lower.
And can you tell us any? I mean, I know it's a public forum.
It's lower because of where it's stored, and it's lower because the safety systems that are required to prevent any consequences are much simpler.
Right, but I'm not asking about consequences.
I'm sorry?
But I'm not asking about consequences. I'm asking about just the event.
The successful attack of that is very different. It's much lower.
Okay.
It's just easier to defend is another way to say it.
All right.
So that would be incorrect.
Okay, that was helpful. And I know, let me just recognize, I think everybody that who's here, that talking about potential attacks in a public forum involves some degree of sensitivity. So I recognize that.
Thank you. Yeah, and just so you're aware, I've been with the NRC for 30 years. One of my jobs as a branch chief was for security and EP. So I think I know what I'm talking about, so I appreciate
I
what
get
you
that.
said. Thank you.
All right, now I just want to come in a little bit. One thing you didn't talk about was just because one thing I want to understand better for both myself and for the members of the public is the nature of the spent fuel, right? So my understanding is that the reason it's underwater, and my understanding the water is borated, right? It has boron in it. So the boron absorbs neutrons and prevents any kind of chain reaction occurring. Is that right?
Not exactly. So the reason that spent fuel is kept inside the spent fuel pool is because when the fuel is spent, that is when it's in the reactor vessel and it's removed, it has what's called decay heat. It takes a relatively long time for it to cool down. So they it's put into the pool full of water to keep it cool for a long time, for a relatively long, depending on how it is, right? So at Indian Point, the plant's been operating for 35 years, is that right? 40, thank you, 40 years. And so they have a variety of spent fuel there that's been removed from the reactor for years. So that's why it's put into a spent fuel pool to keep it cool.
Right, and if it were not underwater in the spent fuel pool, what would happen?
A variety of things could happen. I'm not sure,
I mean,
be a little bit more specific?
Would the cladding catch fire, for example?
It could. One of the things that's postulated is the zirconium fire, yes.
Okay. And then, again, we talked about drying. My understanding is that the drying involves helium, and then you end up with the
Not always, but yes,
right, or at least the Indian point.
yes.
And the idea is basically that the canister ends up full of helium.
Correct.
And what's the purpose of the helium? Why do you need helium there? I mean,
Can you help?
Yeah, to prevent it from an oxidizing environment. So if there was air in there, then it would be an oxidizing environment, and the fuel could degrade. But with the helium, that removes that oxidizing environment, a chance of an oxidizing
Okay.
environment. So it prevents any degradation of the fuel.
right, and does it help with
Daryl's gonna
degradation?
help. Wait, Daryl's going to add on. Okay, you get
Oh, no, go ahead.
If you could just introduce yourself first in the mic, thanks. Go ahead.
Daryl Dunn, NRC. The helium also promotes heat transfer. So it removes the decay heat from the assemblies to the external surfaces of the cast.
Oh, because of convection.
Yeah.
Right, okay, great, all right. So, I was going to say, does this oxidizing environment, I mean, lack of oxidizing environment presumably helps with potential corrosion issues? Okay.
Correct.
So it's all relative, right? When we say oxidizing environment, there are a variety, and the idea of introducing helium is to remove the 19% of oxygen that's in regular air, right?
Right.
So it further reduces any risks like that.
Right, okay, understood, thank you. So, okay. This could take a while, by the way, Tom, I don't need, give me a signal if you want to move along, I mean, you know.
Well, if other DOB members have questions, you know, maybe just flip your card up and we can turn and come back to Richard. But, yeah, we can allow Richard to keep going for a minute and then I'll turn to Sandy.
Okay, let me do a segment on because I should tell you that I did a contention at a reactor in New Jersey about aging management. It was all about corrosion of the secondary containment. And so I learned a bit about aging management systems. And one thing that I was never able to be clear on was the purpose of the system, the aging management program, to detect a problem before it goes through the allowed margin, or was the purpose to detect a problem after it had gone through the allowed margin?
So
I believe before, detect the problem before a problem occurs.
So the aging management program is not designed because we have any major concerns. It's designed as a program for early detection for any aging effects of the SPC casks and the components that are monitoring it, so it can be enhanced and planned to be developed.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that, but let me just, I think I'm going to drill down a little bit. So let's just start with, I understand that the casts, basically, there's an assumption that they don't need an aging management program for some period of time, is that right?
Yeah, I believe.
The first 20 years. Yes.
Right.
And then at renewal at 20 years, the aging management program goes into effect.
Right, and at Indian Point, is that 2028?
Correct.
Right, okay. So, so is there an approved aging management program for the cast at Indian Point already?
Daryl Dunn, NRC. Yes, there is, and it's publicly available. I can give you the Adams accession number if you'd like.
That'd be great.
But it is publicly available.
Okay. So good, all right. So I just want to, you know, this is part of, I should say, part of the idea of this is that we bring out information to the public so everybody knows what's going on. So I just want to do that a little bit with this aging management program. So first question, which is, what methods do you use to detect what kinds of degradation and how often?
Which system are you talking
The
about?
aging management program for the cast.
So there's aging management program for the overpacks that's primarily visual inspection.
Okay.
And then there's interior inspection that's done on one of those every 5 years. And then there's another aging management program for the multi-purpose canister, where there will be one inspection or one canister inspected every 5 years after it goes through it's in its period of extended operation. They have to pick the cast that's going to be the most susceptible to aging effects, so it's typically the one that's been in service the longest and probably an early cast that was loaded at a low heat load so that there's a higher potential for corrosion reactions to occur. If they have a acceptance criteria for that, it's done by a visual inspection. If they don't meet that acceptance criteria, they have to do additional inspections, including
Okay.
volumetric.
So okay. So the acceptance criteria, just to make sure everybody gets it right, which is, the idea is that if you see something that doesn't meet the acceptance criteria, you have to do something, right?
That's correct.
So on a visual inspection, this is of the multi-purpose canister.
Right.
So what's the acceptance criterion?
What the inspection is looking for is indications of aging. So things like pitting corrosion or potentially stress corrosion cracking. And so they're looking at the parts of the canister where they have welds in the canister that could have residual stresses where there's a potential for stress corrosion cracking. And so they're looking for indications of that, as well as pitting corrosion, which can be a precursor to stress corrosion cracking.
Okay. And what happens if you see those?
Well, then you have to, so it would not meet the acceptance criteria if you,
Right.
if you see those. That gets put, then it goes over to the corrective action program for the site, and they have to do an evaluation. They may do additional inspections. They may characterize that part of the canister to determine, whether or not it's it's some iron contamination, some incidental iron contamination that has some corrosion products that looks a little funny, or if it's really pitting corrosion, or if it's stress corrosion cracking. They may do some tests to determine how far that's progressed, and then determine what their need is for either a follow-up inspection to determine how that's progressing, or a corrective action to potentially do some type of mitigation.
Right. So let's take in the unlikely event you see some bad. Well, let me back up a little bit, right? So you're doing one cask, so it's 1 out of 70 at the moment, right?
Correct.
And that'll be 1 out of 100 and something.
Yep.
Why one?
Because there's a very low possibility that we're going to have aging effects on these canisters. They are a stainless steel canister that's very robust and resistant to corrosion, and there's only really one possibility of an aging effect, which is that could compromise the safety function of the canister, and that's chloride-induced stress corrosion cracking. Not a real big issue here at this site. You're too far from the ocean. And you're not close enough to a cooling tower or a salted road to have that be an issue. But if you do one, and again, you have to pick the one that's going to be most susceptible to an aging effect, and you don't meet that acceptance criteria, then you have to do an extended condition evaluation, and that could involve inspection of other canisters. The corrective action program determines how they go forward with that, and the NRC reviews how they've handled that.
Richard, I think this is a good exchange on aging management. Do you have many more questions on aging management? I want to allow if we could finish that topic, and then I'll turn to Sandy Gale.
Right, that's what I was hoping to do.
Yeah, good.
So how do they know which one's most susceptible?
So there's a criteria that's been developed for that. It's actually EPRI has the Electrical Power Research Institute has a susceptibility assessment report that is used to make that determination.
Right, and what does it say?
So it looks at things like what is the age of the canister, the heat load at the time that it was loaded. It looks at site-specific types of parameters, like is that canister on a part of the pad that may be closer to a chloride source, either closer to the ocean or closer to a cooling tower or closer to a salted road? Is it on a part of the pad that might be in a condition where it would get more input from something like that because of prevailing wind conditions? And it also looks at things like, was there known conditions in that canister when it was put into service?
Okay. Because one question I had was, it seems like you've got welding on these canisters, so there's probably some heterogeneity, right?
Some heterogeneity?
Yeah. On the welds.
I
know they're robotic welds, but they're not all exactly the same.
No, but they all have to be inspected, and they all have to pass the acceptance criteria.
Right.
Okay.
But well, let's not. I don't want to get into too many details. I can follow up with you later on that. But let me just ask a couple of questions, which is, if you really had a problem with the multi-purpose canister, which I know is very unlikely, let's ask this question. Have you ever had a problem with a multi-purpose canister to the point where you had to repackage the fuel?
No, we've had issues with bolted casks. We had seal failure issues, and they had to be taken back to a pool and taken apart and seals repaired and replaced.
Oh, okay.
So that's happened with bolted casks, but not for a welded cast. No.
Okay, but you can do that, right? If you had a problem with the welded cast, could you take it back?
The certificate of compliance holder in their safety analysis report, they have to have a procedure for reopening that cask and reflooding and reopening that cask if the need ever arises. So it's already in the COC safety evaluation or safety analysis report. And there are different vendors like Holtec has developed different types of inspection and mitigation methods for their systems.
Right. But what happens when the spent fuel pools are no longer there?
Well, then you don't have that as an option. So you have to do something like what Holtec has developed for an in situ mitigation method.
What does that mean?
So you'd have to have some type of repair that's done on the canister because you don't have a pool, so you can't unload the fuel at the site. So you would have to do a repair on the canister.
Is there an inherent assumption that that's always possible?
Is there?
You're assuming that's always possible. You're saying it's impossible that there's not a fault that would require reloading?
Of a canister?
Yeah.
Our operating experience says no. We haven't had that as something that's been an issue. And there are methods to do in situ types of repairs if the need arises.
Right, I know that, but what I'm asking you is, you just said that for the bolted canisters, some of them had to be reloaded. Let me ask you this question more as a why. Why isn't that a possibility with the multi-purpose canisters?
Because you don't have the same, it's not the same type of system. It's a corrosion-resistant canister. What happened on the bolted cask was you had a seal that was an aluminum coated seal that was in between two stainless steel weld overlay surfaces, and that was a galvanic corrosion problem. You don't have that issue for a welded stainless steel canister.
Okay. And then the last thing I want to ask on this, because I know Tom wants to move ahead, is what about, my understanding is that these canisters, when they're loaded, there's a limit on the amount of decay heat that's allowed in each canister.
Yes.
And so when you have different types of fuel, you make allowance for the amount of decay heat. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's done and why the decay heat is an important parameter?
So why decay heat is important is because we have a maximum fuel cladding temperature limit.
Right, but why?
Because we don't want the cladding to be degraded during a loading or drying operation. We want that cladding it's a regulatory requirement that you cannot damage the cladding.
Okay.
So that's why decay heat is important.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to allow Sandy to ask her question. Are any other DOB members looking to do a question now? We will also have opportunity after the DOE presentation for further exchange, and NRC will still be here at that time. So this isn't our last chance, but Sandy?
Okay, this is not so technical. Emergency planning. I think you've given approval for everybody who asked for an exemption. Is that right?
I think that's correct.
Right.
For a shutdown decommissioning reactor, yes.
Right. Have any of the other plants had a gas pipeline going through their plant?
I don't know the answer to that.
I think the answer may be no.
Well,
You're asking, have we,
Yes.
I would ask if Mike Norris, if he knows, he may not know, but you're asking about all of the United States, right?
I'm
I just
talking
don't
about
know.
the whole United States,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
Is there
just don't
any
know.
other plant that has a gas pipeline going?
and Dave
Several,
Lockbaum,
but
has researched this issue as well. Dave, if you want to speak up.
Yeah, Fort St. Vrain in Colorado has a number of gas pipelines, I think within 400 yards of the SCC. Even though it's an operating plant, Waterford also, I believe, has gas pipelines crossing the site property.
Okay, so you were saying that there are other plants.
There are.
There are, okay, all right. Just, two quick things. The school district lost a lot of money, the community lost a lot of money with Indian Point closing. And so we're trying to figure out ways to access more funds for the community, one of which now we can assess the spent fuel pool and we can assess the dry cask. What have other communities done to be able to reap some revenues in lieu of all the revenues that they have lost over time?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I don't.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm sorry that that's happening to the local community. That's one of the, the negative things that come with
Right,
closing.
maybe
Yucca
if somebody could get back to me with some ideas of ways. I don't know who there is on your staff that might have found that out. The other is, do you have any news for us about spent fuel rods going and dry casks going any other place? Do you have any up-to-date news?
I'm sorry, like where, when you say...
I
transport?
don't know. We've been hearing about New Mexico. We've been hearing
you mean
about Texas.
interim storage as
Yes.
opposed to storing it on
Yes.
site? There are some applications within the NRC that are being considered right now for what's called a centralized interim storage facilities. I think in New Mexico, like you said, it sounds like you know more than I do about it. But I don't know the status of those applications and their approval processes.
All right, maybe somebody else could, maybe there's somebody there that might give us some information.
Good evening, everyone. Neil Sheehan, NRC Public Affairs. So we
yes.
have approved the application for the interim repository proposed for Texas. There's litigation involved with that. We have not yet approved the Holtec interim repository application for New Mexico. Still under review. We expect to issue a decision possibly in February of next year.
Okay. Will Indian Point, the 3 plants, get priority for moving the spent fuel?
Our colleagues from DOE might be able to answer that when
Yes.
they're up next.
Okay.
That's next.
Next one.
Save that one for the Q&A. Thank you, Sandy.
I think I have the answer, but I would just chicken it out.
Susan, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, here you go.
Sure.
You're going to need it.
Just need a lot of microphones. So just to follow up on the question about the New Mexico application. So do you have a sense of the timeline once the application is approved as to when the fuel would start to move off-site?
I'm reluctant to put our DOE colleagues on the spot again, but they would probably be better positioned to answer that. In fact, that's why they were here recently to look at that very topic. And you're going to hear a lot about it during their presentation.
Okay, well, wait. Are they responsible for the next steps after the NRC's license approval?
You were talking about with respect to the interim repository
Interim
applications?
Interim storage.
NRC approves, licenses the interim storage facilities. DOE's responsible, well, they're going to get into the details. I really hate to jump ahead of their presentation.
Neil, could you just say the effect of litigation? So if somebody challenges the license approval, which is an NRC approval, does that put it on hold, or does the repository become operational or under construction while litigation goes on?
I don't want to speak for any legal matters. So as far as where it stands, it is before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Right,
In fact,
I understand that. I'm not asking you to comment on legal matters. I'm asking you to comment on what is the effect.
Was there an injunction? Was there an injunction by the court during the litigation?
Not at this point.
Yeah.
Not at this point.
But what was the effect? I mean, does that mean that the licensee, as far as the NRC is concerned, does the licensee have the ability to act as though it's licensed?
They are not going to proceed until they get, the approval right now, so it's before the court.
They have an approval.
They have the approval from the NRC, it's being
But they're
litigated.
waiting for the litigation to proceed, it sounds like. Okay, thanks, Neil.
Well,
Can
Can I just ask one more question? I'm sorry.
Okay,
You
go
said
ahead.
the on-site inspection program was robust. Can you tell us the frequency of on-site inspections? Thank
Good
you.
question. Yeah.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we inspect the dry runs, and then we inspect the initial loading into a canister. And for Indian Point specifically, right now they're in a continuous offloading campaign, so we're there once a quarter. I was there in September and November. I'll be back in the first quarter. And then once all the fuel is on the pad, we'll be there once every 3 years.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We also do I can't stress this enough, we look at the dry runs for the reason for watching the licensee or their contractors do the work on site without the fuel, and they go just like they do with regular fuel, very slowly, very methodically. They're very careful about how they do this because they're dealing with spent fuel. And we're there to watch the dry run. And we're also there to watch the first loading. Of course, Indian Point has been doing this in the past, but also since they've had spent fuel canisters on site. But now we've been watching them do this on a quarterly basis.
Okay, thank you. Because some of the questions that popped up were for DOE, I'd like to allow for the DOE to get their presentation on the table and then have them be part of the mix for the continuing Q&A that will follow. So at this time, next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to call on Erica Bickford and Stephen Maharis to begin their presentation from the DOE. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting us to speak today. My name is Erica Bickford. I'm the Acting Director of the Office of Integrated Waste Management in the Office of Nuclear Energy at the Department of Energy. I'm going to be speaking today about our program.
$75,000 reward.
Which our program is the Office of Integrated Waste Management. I'm going to talk about our plans for consent-based siting for a federal consolidated interim storage facility, as well as our transportation planning. And then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Steve Maharis, who will talk about our nuclear power plant infrastructure evaluations to support moving the spent nuclear fuel off-site, and the findings that we observed from our site visit to Indian Point this summer. Next slide, please. The department has contracts with utilities to accept the spent nuclear fuel. This is our standard contract disclaimer. We may discuss a variety of topics during today's meeting. However, that doesn't change the terms of that contract. Next slide, please. All right, so the mission of the Office of Integrated Waste Management is currently to implement federal interim storage for commercial spent nuclear fuel following a consent-based siting process. We heard some questions during the previous session about NRC licensing other interim storage facilities in Texas and New Mexico. And just to be clear, the authorization that the department has from Congress is specific to federal interim storage and is specific to consent-based siting. So those two other companies that are seeking licenses from the NRC for their own private interim storage facilities would be separate from what the department is pursuing at this time. Next slide, please. All right. And so you'll notice that mission statement doesn't currently include disposal, and that is because we're currently authorized by Congress to pursue interim storage and only interim storage. We certainly hope, it's our expectation that in the future we...
Excuse me, Erica, if you could please pause for a moment. I think we're having some... Yeah, there's a slight echo. And so I think if you slow down just a little bit, it'll be a little better for the audience here in person.
Okay.
Thank you.
How am I sounding now?
That's a little better, but so if you could just do your best to keep it slow paced. That way, it will be less of impact on the echo.
Okay. So we are, as I mentioned, we're focusing on interim storage at this stage because that's what we're authorized to focus on, but we do have the expectation that we will be hopefully authorized to pursue consent-based siting for disposal facilities as well. But in the near term, pursuing federal interim storage will allow us to remove the spent nuclear fuel from the nuclear power plant sites, including sites like Indian Point, provide us with some opportunities for research on the long-term management of spent nuclear fuel, hopefully build public trust and confidence in the DOE's ability to fulfill its obligations to accept the spent nuclear fuel material, as well as begin addressing taxpayer liabilities. To date, due to a partial breach of contract by the department to begin accepting the fuel in 1998, about $9 billion of taxpayer money has been paid out to settle those contract disputes. So this is an important issue for really all taxpayers to care about addressing our spent nuclear fuel. Next slide, please. We are pursuing a consent-based process for siting federal interim storage facilities. Again, this was authorized by Congress, recommended by Congress to use a consent-based siting process. The term consent-based siting originated from a Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future final report that was done back in 2012 and recommended that the U.S. pursue a consent-based approach for siting nuclear waste storage and disposal facilities. So we are enacting that recommendation. Compared to past facility siting efforts, consent-based siting is intended to be more of a bottom-up process, focusing on communities and their concerns and needs. There's been many different approaches taken in the US and internationally. We think at this point in time, a consent-based approach that accounts for community well-being and their needs is really the right approach to take at this point in time and our best chance for success. Next slide, please. All right, so the department had done some work on consent-based siting in the 2015 to 2017 time period, and then we had a policy change, and then fast forward to 2021, and we have another policy change. And so this iteration of consent-based siting formally kicked off just about a year ago with issuance of a Federal Register notice with a request for information. And the reason we did this was we'd collected a lot of public input in the 2015 to 2017 time period, but since it had been, 4 years or so since we had last engaged, we wanted to provide an opportunity to seek additional input or feedback and understand whether the feedback or input we'd received several years prior was sort of still the status or still the opinions of the people and organizations that provided it, or whether anything had changed in the interim. We also focused this RFI on the consent-based siting process itself, how to conduct that process, how we engage a broader range of the public than maybe past efforts have, as well as incorporating issues of equity and environmental justice into this process. Next slide, please. We received around 225 comments from a wide variety of entities, tribal and state governments or organizations, local governments, non-governmental organizations or nonprofits, industry, academia, and others. We compiled the information that we received into a summary report that we published on our website in September. You can see the cover page here on this slide. You're welcome to go to our website, energy.gov/consent-based siting. We published all of the original comments we received as well. I think it's on the order of about 1,700 pages with any any contact information redacted, but you can see all the original comments if you'd like, as well as access the summary. Next slide, please. So some of the feedback that we've received through this recent RFI, as well as in the past, was that in order to conduct meaningful engagement with the public and state governments and tribal governments and others, the department needed to provide resources to enable that meaningful engagement to occur. So we took that feedback, and in September, the department issued a funding opportunity announcement, $16 million total. The focus of this funding opportunity is to support public engagement, broad public engagement. We plan to make around 6 to 8 awards, and for those awards to have a period of performance of up to 2 years. To be clear, we are not yet asking for communities to volunteer to be considered to host a federal interim storage facility. That will be a later part of the process. Our goal is to identify willing and informed host communities that eventually will enter into an agreement to host a federal facility, one or more federal facilities. And we understand that we need to spend some time working on that information exchange so that we can get to the point where communities do feel like they have enough information to make a decision about whether they do want to pursue this or whether they don't want to pursue this. Either outcome for us is considered a success of the process. So early phases of our consent-based siting process are going to focus on mutual learning, information exchange, outreach, and just building national capacity to understand issues related to spent nuclear fuel management and nuclear technology and nuclear waste storage and disposal. And we plan to make those awards this spring. We actually just announced today that in response to several requests we received to extend the due date for those applications, they originally due December 19th. We've extended that due date to the end of January to accommodate those requests that we received. And so we plan to then place those awards next spring and begin engaging with the awardees around that time. Next slide, please. All right, so our consent-based siting process is phased and adaptive. We'll be incorporating feedback and new information we receive as we go, and it'll inform next steps. Our current near-term objectives are to further develop the consent-based siting process. We had issued a draft consent-based siting process in 2017. We've been incorporating additional information and hope to release an updated version of that quite soon. We'll be making those awards. Those will be cooperative agreement awards from that funding opportunity announcement, and begin engaging with those awardees and getting input from their processes. And we'll also be clarifying our broader strategy for an integrated waste management system. And by that, I mean an overall system that includes storage, disposal, transportation, as well as the interfaces between each of those components. And you'll note there that I do include disposal as part of the overall integrated waste management system. While we're not pursuing any siting for disposal at this time, we still recognize it as part of that system that we need to eventually implement. Next slide, please. We have a number of activities that we're also working on in parallel. We especially want to address societal challenges. We've incorporated a bunch of social scientists at the federal level and at our national laboratory levels to support that component of our program and help us design a better process for consent-based siting and our outreach and engagement and how we incorporate feedback that we get. We're going to continue talking about the need for a disposal pathway. We, of course, conduct research and development to support eventual disposal options, but need to make sure that that's front of mind, that we're not overlooking the need for a disposal option while we pursue interim storage. We continue to do research on extended storage of spent nuclear fuel. We're now starting to consider questions related to managing spent nuclear fuel that may be produced from future advanced reactors that may look quite different from the types of reactors that we currently have. So we're starting to take a look at that and working with reactor design companies and collecting information. And then any nuclear waste program is multi-decadal, if not a centennial length program. We've certainly had, folks who've been around. I actually have a colleague who's retiring this month who's been working for the federal government for 43 years. So we have a lot of folks who are reaching retirement age and heading off to hopefully, better and brighter things. But we want to make sure that we're retaining as much of that expertise and knowledge as they go, so that as we bring new people into the program, we can be disseminating that historical knowledge and that great information and not losing it. Next slide, please. If you want to stay up to date on our consent-based siting activities, we do have an email listserv. You can go to energy.gov/consent-based siting, scroll down to the bottom of the page, and you can enter your email address there. It's not a high volume of emails. It's on the order of 1 to 2 a month. We issue announcements like today's announcement that went out through that listserv that we extended the deadline for the funding opportunity announcement applications. And if we publish new documents and things like that, we announce it through that mechanism as well. Next slide, please. Quickly, I wanted to cover a little bit about our plans for transporting spent nuclear fuel from the nuclear power plant sites when we do have that federal interim storage facility available to receive them. We have a number of activities, and these are not fresh activities that we're starting brand new. This really builds on a lot of historical work that's been done from prior programs at the departments, our partners at the US Navy that transport spent nuclear fuel, and many lessons learned from domestically and abroad. But just to kind of paint the picture of what the spent nuclear fuel transportation system looks like, here's a map of the US showing where all the reactors are. We've got about 74 different commercial reactor sites, 20 of which are shut down, like Indian Point. Eventually, we'll need to remove the spent nuclear fuel from all of them to as yet determined destinations. But just based on the scale of the size of the country and the number of facilities that we'll be transporting from, this is going to be a large-scale spent nuclear fuel transportation operation. So just to kind of paint a picture in your mind of what this could look like. Next slide, please. And also, just to give you another visual, the photo on the right shows what spent nuclear fuel will look like in transportation on rail cars. We are planning to primarily use rail transport to move spent nuclear fuel due to the size and weight of these packages. They'll look very much like this with some variations in size, and the type of cradle, the blue thing is called a cradle, and how they connect to a rail car, but it's all variations on a theme. And so a number of the activities that we are pursuing to be prepared to transport spent nuclear fuel when that federal interim storage facility becomes available is developing specialty rail cars, a number of computational tools. We're engaging with state and tribal government partners to develop planning. We're hoping to conduct a package performance test to build public trust and confidence in the safety of the transport of this material. And we're also looking at site-specific histories and the on-site and near-site infrastructure conditions that we'll need to account for to eventually remove the spent nuclear fuel. And that's what Steve Maharis is going to talk about next. Next slide, please. All right, so in North America, the Association of American Railroads is the standard-setting organization for freight rail. It's a longstanding organization, and they have a standard S2043, which is specific to designing rail cars for transporting high-level radioactive material. The U.S. Navy was the first entity to design a rail car meeting this standard, and it took them about 10 years to do it. It's a very rigorous standard that has many testing requirements and very finite parameters that you have to meet. So following their lead, we began in 2014 to look at developing specialty rail cars for transport of commercial spent nuclear fuel. The Atlas rail car, which is pictured in the top left here, is our 12-axle rail car that's designed to carry spent nuclear fuel casks. It has been designed, fabricated, and finished its first round of single car testing. It will have to go through multiple car testing and demonstration runs in order to be approved for use on the commercial rail network. In addition, we've designed an 8-axle cask-carrying rail car that has had an approved design, and we've entered into a contract this summer for fabrication and testing of that rail car. We have a rail escort vehicle that we collaborated on with the U.S. Navy in the design. Again, the U.S. Navy transports spent nuclear fuel from the nuclear Navy fleet. They were in the process of designing a new rail escort vehicle to meet this S2043 standard, so we were able to partner with them, and we're using the exact same design. Their rail escort vehicle looks just like this picture in the lower left, but theirs is blue and ours is gray. And we are developing an integrated safety and security monitoring system for these rail cars that will include safety monitoring of 11 different parameters on the rail car, things like ball bearing temperatures, vertical, horizontal, and lateral acceleration, other parameters, things called truck hunting, which may be of interest if you're a rail aficionado, and things of that nature, as well as the security components. These shipments will travel with armed guards for each shipment. Next slide, please. One of our computational tools that we've developed is called the Stakeholder Tool for Assessing Radioactive Transportation, or START. It's a web GIS-based tool that allows us to visualize a number of geospatial data. So for example, rail networks, highway networks, waterway networks, the location of nuclear power plants, locations of emergency response assets, so fire departments, police, hospitals. It's a very useful tool for our own analysis, systems analysis purposes, so we can look at what different questions about how many rail cars we think we may need to have and what the transport rate we think of the system and how much fuel we'll be able to transport each year. But we also use it to engage with our state and tribal partners to discuss questions related to route preparedness, how to train along a route, identify gaps in training. The department has a Transportation Emergency Preparedness Program, or TEP, for its shipments of radioactive materials. So we've included the TEP training data in there, and we update that every 6 months. Allows us to clearly visualize where you might have a transportation route and whether people are TEP trained along it, or maybe that's an area where we want to provide more resources for training. That's just one example. Next slide, please. We do a fair amount of intergovernmental engagement. This is a long-standing activity that goes back in the department since the 1990s, and it's had kind of starts and stops in that time as well. We have been funding cooperative agreements with 4 state regional groups. In the Northeast is the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference that operates a committee of Northeast state representatives. We also fund an entity to support engagement with federally recognized tribes. We have a subset of state and tribal government representatives that we engage with through our Nuclear Energy Tribal Core Group, or Transportation Core Group, sorry. We coordinate quite a bit with our federal agency partners at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, at the Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Coast Guard, Army Corps of Engineers, any entity that may have a role or a regulatory authority that may intersect with our plans for transporting spent nuclear fuel, we try to engage with. The department has a National Transportation Stakeholders Forum, or the NTSF, which is the mechanism the department uses to communicate with states and tribes about departmental shipments of radioactive material. That entity
Erica, if you can hear us, your screen has frozen.
and state and
okay,
tribal
you're
government
back.
participation in that as well. If you want to learn more about NTSF, I put our new website on there as well, ntsf.info. Next slide, please. In addition, under the NTSF, we operate, our program leads a number of ad hoc working groups. These are smaller groups comprised of state, federal, and tribal government representatives to look at questions and issues related to spent nuclear fuel transport. So whether it's rail car inspection protocols that we've been working on, or identifying mechanisms for and procedures for providing technical assistance and training funds to states and tribes along future transportation routes. Those are some of the two main activities. We also engage with state and tribal government representatives on developing communications materials around our program as well. Next slide, please. And then the last item I'm going to mention is our plans to conduct a package performance test. And this would be for a full-size rail cask. And in the US, we have never done full-scale package testing on a rail-size cask of the size that we're planning to use for future DOE transport of spent nuclear fuel. We've done scale model testing and a lot of computer modeling testing, which all meets regulations. But it has been recommended by various bodies, including the National Academies of Sciences and that Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, that full-scale package testing could be very beneficial in building public trust and confidence in the safety of spent fuel transport. And so DOE's goal in conducting a package performance test would be to build that public trust and confidence and have avenues for public observation and involvement in those testing. As the federal entity responsible for certifying those transportation packages, we would invite the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to participate in these activities as well. This is far from a certainty. This is a high dollar activity. Buying a transportation cask, a single transportation cask, is going to be on the order of $10 million. And then there's all the testing and other ancillary things that come with it. So we are advocating to get appropriations to support conducting this activity and hope to get that in the next few years and be able to conduct this work, which would probably be about a 5-year time period from the time that we're, including procurement of casks and testing facilities and things like that. So this is something that may be of interest to you or your constituents in terms of the future transport of the spent nuclear fuel from Indian Point. Next up, I will hand it over to Steve Maharis to talk about our nuclear power plant infrastructure evaluations. Go ahead, Steve.
Yes. Could you please go to the next slide, to 19? Thank you. So I'm here to talk about the nuclear power plant site infrastructure evaluations that we do. Next, please. So the purpose of these evaluations is to support the planning for the eventual removal of the spent fuel from NPP sites. And we do that by looking at the inventory at the site, the conditions at the site, and the near-site transportation the infrastructure and the site's experience at transporting large, heavy loads, both off-site and on-site, because that could be the model for how the spent fuel casks are moved off-site. We identify any gaps in information needed to ship the fuel from the sites, and based on available information, we identify options for transporting the fuel off-site. Now, at this stage of the evaluations, we are all about the options. So we don't make any decisions on modes or routes or transload locations or anything like that. We present options that could be used in the future. Next, please. So, in terms of the actual evaluations of the sites, really the proof of the pudding is the site evaluations where we actually put boots on the ground. So When we do this, we confirm aspects of the inventories at the sites. We obtain detailed data, and we obtain detailed information on loading maps. So we have an idea of which specific spent fuel assemblies are stored in which specific canister in which specific location. And so we can therefore do very detailed assessments of things like the dose rates from a cask. We can even determine ship-by dates. So the date that a cask could be transported in the future. We also observe the transportation infrastructure at and near the sites. And the other thing is, it's not just the Department of Energy show when we go off and do these evaluations of the sites. We have our tribal, other federal agencies, and state partners. So it is not unusual for us to have a site visit that includes up to 15 people. We'll have people from the FRA, we'll have people from the tribes, we'll have various people from the state agencies, all of whom contribute to the quality of the site visit. And the information provided by the sites, coupled with the opportunity to go to each one of these sites, is critical to our understanding of the conditions at and near the site. Next, please. So one of the main things that we look at is the inventories at the sites. So we have databases available to us that describe the number of spent fuel assemblies at a site. We know the assembly ID and type, its discharge date, its burn up, and its enrichment. We know the canisters that are used at the site. We try to obtain loading maps and logs, etc. And we also look at storage features and conditions, such as the number of damaged fuel assemblies and the number of high burn-up fuel assemblies that are at the site. Next slide, please. In terms of site conditions, we look at the on-site transportation features like the presence of on-site rail, on-site roads for heavy haul truck access and barge access. We also look at the presence of any on-site equipment to support transportation operations, such as transfer casks, cranes, and rigging. We also look at on-site staging areas that might be available for us to use. Some sites are don't have much available in terms of staging areas. Those are very tight sites to work at. They present issues because your space is so constrained. Other sites have got loads of room and they're much less constrained in terms of the space that you have to work in. Next slide, please. We also look at the transportation infrastructure around the site, and that helps us to evaluate the transportation mode options for the sites. We look at near-site rail access, the condition, the capacity of the rail infrastructure. If the site does not have direct rail access, we look at potential transload locations, and then we look at the site's experience with rail transport. We also look at local roads and highways, such as the distance to potential transload locations, i.e. rail spurs or sidings. We look at the characteristics and the conditions of the road and the associated infrastructure. And we also look at the site's experience with heavy haul transport from the site. I'll give you an example. If you look over on the right-hand side, you see the low overhead bridge near the Big Rock Point site. That bridge is 14 feet tall, so I cannot get a spent nuclear fuel cask underneath that bridge. So I will need to take another route to bypass this obstacle. That's just the kind of thing that we look at when we do our evaluations of the sites. We also look at barge access, the characteristics of on-site or nearby barge docks or slips. We also look at the site's experience with barge transport. Next slide, please. In terms of the site's experience, we look at not only spent fuel casks that have been moved off-site, but we also look at various types of components that sites have shipped both to the sites or from the sites, with the idea that loads of comparable weights to a spent nuclear fuel cask on the order of 300,000 pounds could provide the model for how the spent nuclear fuel is moved from the site in the future. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indian Point evaluation that we did. We did this over, we did this in July of this year. We had folks from the DOE, Pacific Northwest National Labs. We had folks from the tribes, TrimTech. We had folks from the FRA, the NRC, the CSG, ERC, and then the New York State agencies had quite a presence. We had folks from the New York State Police. We had folks from Department of Public Service, and then the Department of Transportation, and also NYSERDA. So the visits are structured to be a 3-day affair. The first day was spent on-site at Indian Point, where we look at things like the independent spent fuel storage installation. We also look at the roads that lead to that independent spent fuel storage installation. We look at the barge slips, anything that can help us understand how we might move fuel off that site in the future. Day number 2 was looking at potential transload locations, because the Indian Point site does not have direct access by rail. So we met with the Housatonic Railroad, and we also attended an Indian Point DOB meeting in the evening. Day number 3 was spent on external engagement, so we met in person with the Indian Point DOB, and we had another meeting with the New York State transportation staff to do a deeper dive on transportation issues than we were able to do on day number 2. Next slide, please. So here's an aerial view of the Indian Point site. You can see the Hudson River. You can see potential barge areas on the river. You can see the independent spent fuel storage installation. And then you can see Broadway with its 3 associated entrances and exits from the site. Next slide, please. So here's an aerial view of the independent spent fuel storage installation from 2020. Next slide, please. Here's a view from the independent spent fuel storage installation in the slide on the left. I took the photo looking west towards the Hudson. On the slide on the right, I took the picture looking north. Next slide, please. So here's various equipment that is present at the site, such as the vertical cast transporter. Middle slide is, I'm just south of the barge area looking north up the Hudson. On the slide on the right, I'm looking west towards the Hudson on one of the roads that could perhaps be used to get down to the barge area if barging is the way that is used to remove spent nuclear fuel from the site. But as I said before, at this stage of the game, we're all about options. We don't pick modes or routes. Next slide, please. So we had a chance to look at 8 potential transload locations. That's just a place where a spent fuel cask would be moved from its heavy haul truck transporter to rail. So we looked at 8 sites. Some of these sites were very close to the Indian Point site. Other ones were much further away from the Indian Point site. Next slide, please. This kind of gives you an overview of where these locations are. So we have the Hawleyville Road site. That's the furthest site away, furthest over towards the right-hand side of the slide. Marching back to the site, we have the Seeger Street site that we looked at, Agra Ventures site, the State Line site, the Hopwell Train Yard. Then we looked at the Lower South Street site and the Croton site. Then we drove further north and we looked at a location on the west bank of the Hudson. To get to this location, we would have to cross the Newburgh Bridge. Next slide, please. So here's the Hawleyville Road potential site. So the entrance to the site you'll see in the middle photo. And to get into this site, we would have to take a hard right off of Hawleyville Road, and we'd have to bypass the transmission tower that you see on the left and still make the corner into the site where you see the train tracks on the right. The photo on the left is this site looking towards the southwest. The photo on the right shows one of our team and one of the members of the NRC looking at potential distances that we would have to transload the material at the site. The photo on the bottom left shows 131-pound rail. In our experience, that is very heavyweight rail, more than adequate to support a spent nuclear fuel cask. At some locations, we find 80-pound rail, which is much more of an issue when it comes to supporting large, heavy loads. The photo on the bottom right provides a view of Hawleyville Road looking north. And you can see the train tracks in the approximate middle of the photo. Next slide, please. So here's the Croton site. We're looking southeast in the picture on the left. We're looking northwest on the picture in the middle. And the picture in the right, I've walked a little bit further down the track, and you can see the various spurs that are available at this location. Next slide, please. So here's a location on the west bank of the Hudson. The slide on the left is looking north. The photo on the right is this location looking south, and you can see that we have the beginnings of a spur on this particular line at this location. Next slide, please. We also looked at the presence of schools in the local area. So we drove out to Hendrick Hudson High School and Buchanan Verplank Elementary School. Hendrick Hudson High School is located about a mile from Broadway. That's the kind of pinkish line. The elementary school is located about 0.6 miles from the Broadway. Next slide, please. We also looked at the lower South Street potential transload location. This is much, much closer to the site. The downside of this location is that it's more congested in this area. Also, this is a Metro North track, so they would have to agree to allow us to use that site, and we wouldn't be able to conflict with the local, the commuter traffic that uses this line. Next slide, please. This gives a close-up view at this location. Here we're looking north, and you can see that we have double track in this area. The photo on the left is looking south, and again, you can see we have double track in this area. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of our transport mode options. We've been to 20 sites so far. The last site that we went to was Palisades back in October. The important thing about this particular graphic is that for all the sites that we've been to, everybody has an option for the removal of fuel from the site. So there is no stranded fuel in the United States. Everybody's got options for the removal of fuel from their sites. Some sites have got direct rail. Some sites I would have to go barge to rail or heavy haul truck to rail. Some sites get a little more complicated, like Humboldt Bay, where we have heavy haul truck to barge to rail. For Indian Point, we identified as options heavy haul truck to rail and barge to rail. Next slide, please. With that, I'll take anything that y'all would like to ask.
Steve and Erica, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for your thorough presentations. I think what's on a lot of community members' minds as they think about the potential transport of the fuel are a few things. One, what is the soonest, practically speaking, that we could consider the timing of the shipments of fuel out of this area?
Thanks for the question. So in terms of being able to transport the spent nuclear fuel from Indian Point to a federal interim storage facility, we're estimating that we could have a federal interim storage facility available sometime next decade. There is uncertainty there, not so much with the design, construction, and licensing of a facility. We expect that to be in the range of 5 to 7, maybe 10 years. But because we're pursuing a consent-based siting process, there is a fair amount of uncertainty in the time it will take to reach an agreement with a host community that has sufficient consent to give us confidence in the durability for the long term. We've seen historically in the US, you have a consent or approval or agreement over a short term, but a few years later, in some cases that has no longer been there. So we want to make sure that when we do this, we do it in a way that it can be a durable option for the time period that we need interim storage to operate for until we have a repository available to receive this material. But best estimate at this point, which is subject to a number of factors, is next decade.
Thanks. Once the shipments start, how long would it take to get all the fuel off the site at a place like Indian Point, given the amount of fuel?
Good question, and it depends a little bit on the operations and sort of how any given site it folds into an overall transportation system among the 70 different sites that may be shipping. I think we would expect that it could be as short as within a year, or it could take several years depending on how those operations are designed.
And this might be a question for Steve. In the site assessments and looking at all of the various infrastructure in the region, one of the issues that is of significant concern locally is the presence of the gas pipelines. And how has that factored into your planning?
So the gas pipeline, if we exit the site from the north entrance, we bypass the pipeline, i.e. the pipeline crosses Broadway south of where the north entrance to the plant is. So we would not be driving directly over the pipeline in that area. So as part of the heavy haul truck permitting process though, and we will have to receive permits for moving the fuel by heavy haul truck offsite. And so those permits consider things like the weight of my cask, the dimensions of my cask, and the limitations of the infrastructure, including presence of things like gas pipelines, low overhead bridges, etc.
Thank you. Other DOB members have questions? Sandy.
Okay, this is kind of a hypothetical. You indicated that the DOE would have to get an agreement with the host community. So the host community would be the town, I guess, right? To do this. So if...
Town and the village, I believe.
And the village, okay, together. Okay. So if Holtec is going off in a different direction to get a site, but the DOE has a different site, can Holtec hold back in any way if the DOE says, we have a site, we can start that process, let's get going? I mean, I'm just trying to think long term, what the relationship is with Holtec having their own private place versus the DOE is not a private place, it's a public place for disposal. Is that a question that's understandable? Who makes money out of it? Bottom line.
Sorry, it sounded like to me that might be a question for Holtec, so I didn't want to step in.
Go ahead, Erica.
Oh, that sounds to me like a question for Holtec. My understanding would be that if DOE has a facility available to receive spent nuclear fuel, my expectation is that the spent fuel owners would make that fuel available to be picked up by DOE and transported off their sites. If a site elected not to do that, I would expect that would be a highly unusual circumstance. But again, I can't speak for Holtec.
There was a part of your question, though. I want to make sure that there's clarity around which community you're seeking consent from. Right. Erica, could you just clarify that point?
Sure. So for a community that hosts a federal interim storage facility, we would be seeking consent from that community. And there was a question on how we're defining community and whether that was a town. In some cases, it may be a town. In some cases, it may be a county. In some cases, it may be a tribe. We're trying not to be too narrow at this stage in the process because we really want to leave ourselves open to hear inputs, ideas, from the people that we engage with through our consent-based siting process. So it could look different in different locations.
Thank you. Rich, I don't know if you're prepared to answer a question about Holtec's other businesses outside of
If anything, I'll
Indian
talk
Point.
to our legal staff and then see how we would arrange when we would go in the queue with DOE to get it shipped off site.
Does Holtec make, if you have your own facility for disposal that you get a place in, you're talking about New Mexico.
Right.
Do you have an interest in that, a financial interest in that place?
In New Mexico?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So you would prefer to have it go there than the Department of Energy having a different place that would be a public place, a Yucca Mountain type place?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you'd lose money on that deal.
Absolutely.
So we have to watch you, I guess, right?
Yeah.
For 10 years.
We'll bring you back for that part of the process. Any other questions from the DOB? Yes, Richard?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm also, I think a lot of people are confused about this because, and we heard the DOE as it was said on the slide during the summer, and it took me a while to figure out what was going on. So what I think what I figured out, and I just want to check and also to see if other people understand this, is that there's the federal interim storage facility program, then there are a completely separate private interim storage facility programs.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't understand, I think that's right. So let's assume that's right. What I don't understand is who is developing the ability of the private entities to transport the fuel from the reactor sites to those interim storage sites. Does DOE have any involvement? If they don't, which federal agencies are involved in licensing and approving that?
Erica, do you want to start on that one?
Oh, sure. It's real quick for me. If it's private companies moving spent nuclear fuel from nuclear power plants to private interim storage facilities, then the Department of Energy would currently have no involvement in that.
Right. So which federal entities do have involvement in that?
So the Department of Transportation would regulate the transportation, and then I'll leave it to my NRC colleagues to chime in on any role they have.
Daryl Dunn, NRC. So the NRC has licensed transportation casks. So for the canisters that are here at Indian Point, there is a transportation cask that has been approved for the transport of those canisters, the High Star 190. Once that's on the road, once those systems are loaded and they're on the road, then DOE has regulatory authority there. Okay. So we do the licensing of the cask. The rules for the transport are DOE. DOT, sorry, DOT.
Oh, DOT.
DOT.
Right, okay. Yeah, I was gonna say.
DOE, no, DOT.
So, I mean, so why is DOE developing a separate cask if you already have a cask?
I don't know that DOE is developing a separate cask.
A separate transportation, yeah.
They're talking about a rail car.
Right.
Okay, and they're talking about a facility.
Right.
That could be licensed. The consent-based siting process.
Right. So you do the NRC. How does a transportation cask get loaded onto a rail car? I mean, what does it look like? Does it look like what DOE have got, or is it something totally different?
So that those casks that you saw in those pictures, those are licensed. Those were licensed by the NRC.
When you say those casks,
Right. Those transportation casks, and shown in those pictures.
The dumbbell shapes.
Yes. Yes. Okay. I believe some of them were probably West Valley, but those were transportation casks licensed by the NRC. So we reviewed and approved those transportation cask designs.
Daryl, can you talk a little bit about what we look at when we license the transportation casks, like, accident scenarios, things like that?
Sure, yeah, so the regulations for transportation casks are in 10 CFR Part 71, and there are very rigorous requirements, especially for a cask like a fissile material Type B package, which is what you have for spent fuel. There's a number of tests that they have to be conducted, or evaluations that have to be conducted to show that those systems will maintain confinement and criticality control and shielding under normal conditions of transport and hypothetical accident conditions. And some of those tests for hypothetical accident conditions are quite significant. 30-foot drop onto an unyielding surface, 4-foot drop onto a 6-inch diameter steel rod, immersion in a fully engulfed hydrocarbon fire at 1475 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes, submersion in up to 50 feet of water, and there's requirements that they have to meet in terms of dose, leakage rates, and criticality control after all of those tests are completed. So it's a very rigorous regulation that we have to meet for that.
Right, so I guess this is a question for DOE. So are these casks already fully licensed and loaded, the ones that DOE is going to use? Are they already fully licensed and ready to go?
In some cases, yes. So it's called a certificate of compliance. In other cases, there would need to be updates to the certificate of compliance. But something that may be more pertinent of an answer to your question is that most of these transportation casks have not yet been fabricated. And so with some exceptions in general, you have different transportation casks used versus the storage casks that are used on site. So the department, for DOE shipment of spent nuclear fuel, we would need to procure those transportation casks, provide them to a site. The site would be responsible for loading them, and then DOE would transport those casks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Right.
Thank
Sure.
you, Rich. John Sipos, do you have some questions?
Hi, good evening. Erica, thank you, and Steve, for your presentations tonight. Just at the beginning of your presentation, did I hear you say that $9 billion with a B, has been paid out by the federal government for the contract breaches?
Yes, that's correct.
And that financial figure is current as of what date?
I believe September of this year, but I'd have to check on that. It's a number that continues to grow.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And those funds come from, is it the Department of Justice Judgment Fund?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question.
I just want to explain the significance of that.
So there has been, I think, an issue generally in state and federal regulation in that regulatory space about what happens to that money, how that money is used, the money recovered from the contract breaches. And in some instances, nuclear power plants would seek payments from the decommissioning fund, which is a separate fund, use that for certain spent fuel management purposes, and at the same time they would still have a contract breach or breach of contract claim against the federal government. Later on, they would receive or obtain this money from the United States government, paid from the judgment, from the Department of Justice Judgment Fund. And then the question is, well, what happens to the decommissioning trust funds that initially paid that money out? And how does that affect the timeline, the speed of which, or the speed of overall decommissioning and site restoration, which is also important, especially to the state of New York. How fast is that project going? So I think Tom and I and the other folks from the state, Erica, we very much appreciate that up-to-date cost accounting concerning the judgment fund and contract breach payout. So that was the question I had for DOE.
Tom, I have one more quickie if I can.
Go ahead.
So It occurs to me that a private entity could attempt to move fuel to an interim storage facility and then attempt to suggest that that was reimbursable through the judgment fund. Has DOE thought about that idea?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I
An
lost the
entity
first part.
could save you money by moving fuel to their own interim storage facility and then claim a reimbursement for that because they've avoided your cost.
I guess it's not clear to me where the avoided costs are. One of the challenges of the circumstance and the funding is that it's not necessarily a direct offset. So for the department's activities, the funds that we use to pursue federal interim storage and transportation would be appropriated by Congress, whereas things like the judgment fund payouts from the breaches of contract are paid out of the judgment fund, which is not an appropriated amount of funds. So just a shorthand is that the ledgers don't offset.
Right, understood. But I mean, let me just say that the offset costs are if somebody else moves fuel from Indian Point to an interim storage facility, you don't have to, right? So there's an offset cost.
Well, I think there's a question on whether they would seek reimbursement for
Well, that's what I'm asking, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if they would or if they could.
Other questions? There may have been questions also for NRC. I know I had to move on to the DOE, so any other questions? For DOE or NRC? Okay.
Somebody texted me once, so let me ask you something that somebody texted me, which is a question, which is there a requirement in federal law for a permanent disposal facility before setting up interim storage facilities?
Was that question for DOE?
Well, DOE, I'm not sure who.
Yeah.
Sure. So for DOE, so the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 as amended is what establishes DOE as the responsible entity for accepting the spent nuclear fuel from nuclear power plants. And as designed, there is a provision for DOE to have a monitored retrievable storage facility, MRS, which is equivalent to what we now call a consolidated interim storage facility. And there is a limitation in the current Nuclear Waste Policy Act language that in order to be able to receive fuel at a monitored retrievable storage facility or a consolidated interim storage facility, there would need to be a license to construct a repository. So that is a limitation on what we're currently doing. However, Congress has authorized the DOE to pursue interim storage. Congress believes that we have enough authority under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act currently to make significant progress. Our assessment is that we can pursue consent-based siting, design, and preparation of a license application is how far we can get, but we will not be able to construct and operate an interim storage facility without new authorization.
Right. So doesn't that mean unless the law is changed, that 10-year, that next decade time horizon that you gave is unrealistic?
It's highly uncertain for sure. Yeah, whenever you need new legal authorization. It's certainly our hope that by demonstrating a successful consent-based siting process, and especially when we get to the point where we're seeking volunteers, that will demonstrate enough confidence in the success of this process that Congress will be motivated to act.
Wait, you're not seeking authorization, you're seeking Congress to overturn its prevention of this activity, correct?
For our purposes, it could be new legislation or it could be congressional authorization through another mechanism. There's flexibility for us.
Sorry, I'm confused. I thought we just said that federal law currently prevents the construction of a DOE interim storage facility if there isn't a disposal facility in place. Is that right?
Under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, that's correct.
Okay. So doesn't that mean that unless the law is changed, the timeline is dependent on when a final repository can be constructed?
Either a change to the law or a new authorization from Congress.
What's the second part of your answer confuses me. Are you suggesting that you can overturn federal legislation by something other than a new law?
There's different mechanisms. For example, our current pursuit of federal interim storage is under authorization from Congress that was passed as part of an appropriations bill. So
separate statutory authorization.
That's still a new law. It's just under a different. I mean, it's just in a must-pass vehicle. All right, okay, I think I understand what you're saying.
It's in the budget, so.
Okay.
Tom, it's very hard to hear her answer. Could you please summarize what she just said?
Right. She explained, and Erica, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe she explained that the authorization that DOE has for pursuing the interim storage sites is through separate statutory authorizations that were provided to the DOE through, a budget appropriation or an act of Congress, separate act of Congress. Erica, did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. The fiscal year 21 and fiscal year 2022 appropriations for the Department of Energy included that language that authorized
Fiscal year 21, 22,
22.
authorizations to the DOE included authorizations for them to pursue these sites.
Right.
Despite the federal law.
No,
They're-
wait,
they're-
pursue but not construct, I think is the right.
Pursue
Design-
but not construct,
Right.
is that correct, Erica?
I mean, the language doesn't say pursue but not construct, but it does say for the department. I can't think of the exact language at this time.
But to
that's
plan,
the
essentially to
department
plan.
Right.
interim storage, yeah. And Congress has asked us, or some members of Congress have asked us to provide them with feedback on what we can do under that current authorization, under both that authorization as well as the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, until we need further action from Congress. So those discussions are occurring.
And Erica, on that last point, has the DOE provided those members of Congress with DOE's view as to the extent of the scope of its authority under that budget?
When we're asked the question, our response has been that we believe that we can, develop a consent-based siting process, pursue sites, design a facility, and prepare a license application, but that we won't be able to construct and get to operate a facility without further action from Congress.
And has that communication been reduced to a letter or in writing to Congress?
We've gotten questions for the record and different mechanisms that I've seen that come through, and I can't say for sure. The questions for the record do go back to the member eventually, but it goes through a long review process before, so I can't speak to whether there is a specific letter publicly available at this point, but we do have it in some of our public materials that I can try to provide you.
Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Brianna. Thank you for your colleagues who joined to answer questions. Really greatly appreciate the partnership with our federal agency partners. And really appreciate all the work that you do every day to help keep these communities safe. And the planning that you're doing, is critically important. Even though it's many years away, it's going to take a while to get all of this in place. And Steve, your presentation showing all of the considerations that have to be made shows why it's so important to do the planning this far in advance. So we really greatly appreciate your presentations and the information exchange, your willingness to answer the questions. And I hope you will return. I think there will likely be a lot of questions we get from our members in the community following this presentation. We always endeavor to answer questions we get during meetings and after meetings. To the extent we don't answer them at the meeting, we always intend to answer them in writing ahead of the next meeting. If we get any questions following this for the NRC or the DOE, we'll be sure to reach out to you and ask for responses that we can provide to the members of the public. So again, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for inviting us. Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Terrific. At this point, we're going to turn to public statements. We have a number of speakers pre-registered. Tom Kazmarek, who is attending tonight's meeting virtually, is going to call on speakers. Each speaker has 3 minutes. Your statements will be entered into our record. If you have questions, we will endeavor to answer those questions before the next meeting of the DOB in writing, and we will post those answers on our website. So Tom, are you with us, and can you begin to call on the registered speakers?
Yes, can we go to the next slide, please?
Next slide.
Next slide again. As Tom mentioned, again, as you're called on we're going to actually start tonight with those joining the meeting in person, and I'll read off your names here so you can be prepared to come up to the mic and speak. But during the portion where those joining by Zoom will be delivering their public statements, we will unmute your line when it is your turn to speak. Next slide, please. As Tom mentioned, we'll have 3 minutes for each speaker to speak. I will make a note when there's 30 seconds left, just to make sure you can begin to wrap up your comments. And again, at 3 minutes, to afford everyone the opportunity, we'll move on to the next speaker. So with that, we're going to begin with those who registered first, and we're going to begin with those in Cortland. First up is Marilyn Ellie, and then following Marilyn, we'll go to Tina Voltzbonger.
Marilyn Ellie, please come to the mic, and Tina will be next.
All right, and Tina, when you're ready to begin, go right ahead.
Oh, please come to the mic.
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
Marilyn.
Take your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Marilyn Ellie. I am a Cortland resident, and I should have put my glasses on. I think we can do this. First of all, thank you. This has been a very informative meeting. I'm particularly interested in that last question. It looks to me like we have two branches of our government at odds with each other and not settled. I would certainly like more information about the law as written and what DOE's authorization is for that. And I'd also like to think about the other information that I heard tonight, and after thinking about it, maybe come up with some questions that I would like to refer to the DOE. But I'm really here tonight to take a step back in time. I know everyone at this board is really ready to move on from emergency preparedness. You've looked at it, you've had some experts, and made some decisions. However, it's still a grave community concern. And I'm looking at the notice announcing the meeting concerning Indian Point decommissioning. This was November 16th, 2022. And what it says at the bottom is the Oversight Board is charged with assessing how to protect the financial, environmental, physical interests of the communities affected by decommissioning, including the interests of the current workforce as it relates to continuing public safety of the surrounding communities. That's a really important part of your charge. And a lot of the questions in regard to an emergency evacuation plan have been left hanging. What I would like to see, and I think would be useful to many others, is some kind of booklet, the kind that we used to get when Indian Point was operating. And you know, I understand now that you can go to the website and download copies of some of these booklets. I can't think that's going to be useful for a whole lot of people. A, to find it, B, to download it, and C, to just remember, you know, how to get there. So I think people in the 10-mile area deserve something concrete in their hand that they can look at and say, okay, should we have an emergency between the spent fuel rods and the gas line, this is what you do. Because right now, those two emergency plans are in conflict with each other, and that's really not acceptable. So I would ask this board to really see what you can do about actually producing something. Not something that Holtec says, okay, fine, it's all well, no danger to the public, which we hear a lot of, but something that is sensible based on the expert opinions and something that people can read and look at and understand. So please don't take this off the table, and we'll certainly be back later in regard to all the things that we've heard tonight. It was a very useful hearing, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, Tina Volsbongar, and then following that will be Christopher Vargo.
Hi, I'm Tina Volz-Bongar, and I was here at the last meeting to present on Community Emergency Preparedness Plan and a co-location incident of the gas pipelines in Indian Point. And, you know, I've always heard that the NRC is responsible for everything, including public safety. And what it feels like as a community member is that the NRC is responsible for everything, but accountable for nothing. And right now we have this. And my neighbors who speak Spanish, they can't read this. 43.5% of our population is Hispanic. And they don't, you know, yes, some of them can read this, but we live in an environmental justice community, which I know some of you know, and we really need to walk the talk here. So I'm asking our federal representatives who came through to demand a risk assessment of the pipeline that PHMSA is doing and that no one has yet. It occurred to me today when I was driving, I said, you know why we don't have the risk assessment? Because that's the big question. It's been done for 6 months. I said, I bet it's in the NRC's hands. That's why we haven't seen it. Of course, Tina. So, Senators Schumer and Gillibrand, we're asking you to call on the NRC, and I believe this board. I think that what Marilyn read is correct, that you have some agency here, and what has happened is that you end up being accountable for everything. And in a sense, are you responsible for this? How are we going to fund the right kind of risk, disaster risk analysis, which is what we need. So Grassroots Environmental Education is going to sponsor an experts forum on Indian Point in February, on February 16th. We're asking a disaster risk management expert to come and speak to us, or the division at Columbia University, to tell us exactly what's involved with the right kind of disaster risk analysis, management analysis, and that's done by forensic disaster risk experts who come in and look at something like 9/11. That's real to us. We lived through 9/11, and we had Indian Point was a target. And could those Ziffy pad, could that survive a 747 jet with jet fuel burning for over an hour and a half? You know, what would happen then? And I believe that those are the kinds of questions and answers that we should have and we deserve. So anyway, thank you very much for allowing me to speak and go over my 3 minutes, and I'll talk to you again.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you. Next, Christopher Vargo, followed by John Sullivan.
Christopher Vargo.
How you doing? I'm Chris Vargo. I live at 26 Hardy Street in Verplank, lifelong resident. Can you understand me with the mask on?
Yes.
I'm going to talk to you like I talk. At this point, we've known Indian Point was going to close down in 2017, and we're having a discussion about removing the fuel off-site. Yucca Mountain was proposed in 1987. It's still not accepting nuclear waste. Your whole perspective is just completely distorted. Mrs. Galoff asked, excuse me, Assemblywoman Galoff, I apologize. She said, does anybody have any idea about economic development? The place is closed. Our taxes are going through the roof, and we're talking about it now. Both of those domes are filled with radioactive water. I hear no discussion of it. I hear the riverkeeper's here, he doesn't bring it up. Are there any radiological devices that can indicate any leakage of radioactive water into the Hudson? Does anybody know?
Yeah.
Let me say, I mean, I know
Go ahead.
this isn't a
Go ahead,
question and answer
Richard.
session, but I just want to say that this wasn't, the reason we haven't talked about it this session is because we're going to do that in a separate session.
But that's
We're
my
talking about
exact
it.
point, though.
We can't talk about every issue in every
But
meeting,
don't you
right?
think it's more important to talk about how to dispose of the water that's in the domes and how to get an economic development plan before talking about removing waste that there's no place to put it in?
I mean, with respect, everything's important, right? We have to try to deal with all of these issues. We've already talked to some in previous meetings a little bit about this water issue. It's coming up. The discharge of that water won't occur until we figure out what's going to happen to it. The costs. Wait. The costs are already there. We want to make sure that they don't leak, they don't have a problem while they're there. It's not just about moving the fuel off site, it's about storing it safely while it's on the site. And that's an important issue too. And people in the community have been concerned about that issue, which is why it's on the agenda.
But in my mind, I would put devices in the water now to see if there was an accidental leak into the Hudson River.
Okay, let me.
Richard, if I may, we could be here all night. We've got to try to get to all the speakers. Your points are well taken. There is radioactive monitoring in the water. That's ongoing. Department of Health publishes that data. It's on a website.
Fantastic. That
Okay,
makes me feel
so
better.
I just wanted to clarify that, but I do want to let you finish your 3 minutes. So go ahead.
Basically, that's it. I'm just concerned about the radioactive water in the domes. It seems like there shouldn't even be discussion. It has to be removed. End of conversation. Can't be released into the Hudson. And my other problem is the economic development. There's no plan. There's absolutely no plan. I feel like the community is left holding the bag. I think Holtec, it's a $2 billion cleanup. Am I correct in that number? That's how much, there's a lot to clean it up. So, I mean, it's just some of the things you do. Cover up the casks. It's brackish water in the Hudson River. You understand what I'm saying? Just simple things to make the community feel safer. You know, it's just, you know, you get everything clear in your head and you come to speak, it gets muddled.
No, it's not muddled. I think you've made clear points.
But I
we
appreciate your
it.
time. I hope it's understood.
Thank you. It is.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Next, we have John Sullivan, and following that will be Paul Blanch.
Okay, thank you. John Sullivan, Requa Street, Peekskill. Just a point of information about the brackish water. The Iona Marsh, the NRC, is a saltwater marsh. It's the furthest saltwater marsh on the river. So there is salinity in the river. I don't know the degree of corrosion or the degree of salinity. So it's not the ocean. So about 7 questions. I hope the DOE folks are online. I'll just run through them real quick. Okay, will the NRC DOE comply with the 2004 Appeals Court ruling and establish a deep geological repository following the National Academy Safety Guidelines of 300,000 years? That's what the National Academy of Sciences expects out of a deep geological repository. Number 2, as consent-based pricing, will the NRC and the DOE forego their safety preemption? All right, if they don't, I would compare it to greasing the pig, what the process is. Third, is the DOE committed by law or regulation to accept spent fuel in the order of reactors closing? Okay. 4, given issues of transportation and processing at any repository, including the consolidated ones, what would be a reasonable expectation of how many canisters could be processed in a year? 5, roughly how far down the queue are units 2 and 3? So how long do we have to wait? Okay? Number 6, if Holtec and Orano succeed in their scheme to establish consolidated interim storage facilities, will they be able to choose how they accept spent fuel based upon their proprietary needs? That's Sandy's question. Okay? Are there currently written regulations by the NRC establishing procedures and practices for such proprietary facilities? What does licensing mean? Are there actual regulations in place now that would govern what the CISFs look like and how they handle stuff? Okay, where do we cross the line between doing that and basically reversing the MPWA of 1982? And given the fact that there is no permanent repository in sight, is that licensing of the CISFs actually a violation of the NWPA of 1982? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. If you could, John, could you please email those questions to us as well? We've captured it with a transcript, but it will be good to have the questions in writing from you, and we'll be sure to follow up with the DOE and NRC and get answers. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Paul Blanche, followed by Dan Galinko.
Thank you and good evening. My name is Paul Blanche and I reside in West Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm familiar, or at least I believe most of the people are familiar with my history. But tonight I want to talk and thank John Sipos. When I was working for him a few years ago, he taught me about the importance of regulations and only regulations, and don't go by, internal papers from any agency. Stick with the regulations. We're working on relicensing. Now, I'd like to talk about a regulation that appears both in the National Waste Policy Act of 1983. It appears in 10 CFR 72.3, where they define spent nuclear fuel and what it is. And it also appears as a firm requirement under 10 CFR 72.122 parentheses L. And let me read it to you, and it's, to me, a very understandable statement that leaves little room for interpretation. And I'll read it verbatim. This is a requirement of decommissioned plants. Retrievability. Storage systems must be designed to allow ready retrieval of spent fuel, previously defined, high-level waste and reactor-related greater than Class C, for the purpose of processing and disposal. This is an extremely important regulation that has been ignored by various people and the NRC. I met with the chairman of the NRC along with Admiral Herring in May about this to try to have discussions. It just didn't go anywhere. We had the good meeting, but no follow-up. But I think this panel board assembly needs to take a careful look at that regulation. Now, when I say what John taught me is go by the regulations, don't go by some internal opinion. And we do have internal opinions from the NRC, but they're not regulations. And they say, well, if we can move the canisters 10 feet or move them somewhere, that meets the requirement. That is not true. I think that this panel, and I have little handouts as far as the definitions from the Atomic Energy Act, Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and 10 CFR 72. But I think this panel needs to really take a look at it. We have no way to ever access that spent fuel, at least from the Holtec cask. Absolutely no spent fuel pool, no dry cask. That's one elephant in the room, and I only have so much time, but there's another elephant in the room.
Just to let you know, you are at your 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll cut it off. That other element is...
Paul, we'll give another 30 seconds or so.
Okay, that other element is on page 3, and that has to do with the residual radiation, what is left on the site. There is no limit to the amount of radiation or radioactive material that the licensee can bury on site. And it makes it essentially a waste site when they leave it. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you understood what I said, and thank you, John, for the education.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Is Dan Galinko present?
Dan, hi.
Thank you. Appreciate the floor. Maybe Dan Galinko, I live in Cortland Manor, have kids in the Hendrick Hutchins School District, elementary school age. Maybe first point of order is that the town to the south of Cortland is Croton, so just for the record, not Croton. Some of the questions here I wish could be answered directly, and it's sort of a shame we don't have a community rep that could directly pose these questions to the participants in these meetings, but that's for another topic. But I think it's good for the board and the NRC to be honest with the public of just how much danger would be to the public if there is a breach of the canisters in some way. I'd like to hear from the NRC what testing has been done about natural gas pipeline explosion and how safe those are under heat, duration of heat, blast, et cetera. That's the risk, and Tina mentioned the possibility of a 747 crashing into the site, but obviously it's a site with a lot of danger, and understanding just how vulnerable those casks are to those types of events is quite important considering we have a 42-inch gas pipeline. Obviously there was an NRC Inspector General report that found some issue with the safety assessment that was done, saying it was reverse engineered, so I think we need a little bit more public confidence around just how safe those casks are in light of highly dangerous gas that's nearby. I guess just another point I'd like to hear is just how close a playground should be to defueling and demolition. We have playgrounds very close to the facility, so that's something I'd be interested to hear the NRC weigh in on. And then just maybe a last point, and a bit of me editorializing, but fuel transport to me seems like a science fiction. You know, it takes 15 years to permit just an electric transmission line in this country. I think we'd be litigating this for 150 years if we're actually going to try to move uranium by rail. So I don't know. I think that's something that everybody should keep in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. With that, we'll move on to our Zoom participants who have asked to speak. First, we have Lee Gaw. Is Lee with us tonight? May I ask if Lee can be unmuted?
Oh, hi, this is Lee.
Hi, Lee. We can hear you.
I'm calling from the town of the Sopus, and we're one of the 7 towns that draw our drinking water from the Hudson. And yeah, I know today's topic was emergency management, but I want to echo the concerns of the other parent. I am a parent. And it is an emergency if any amount of radioactive material is leaking into the Hudson. And it's not easy to find on the Department of Health website, nor are, as some other members of the public have pointed out, it's how would people even know where that information is? I did a quick search, I couldn't find it just now. And I'm surprised that the representative from Riverkeeper seems hostile to the man from Verplank, who had some very legitimate questions. And I just want to say that in addition, a lot of talk was given to rail workers, and I certainly hope that all the actors involved and all the profiteers in this decommissioning are ensuring the health and safety of rail workers. It's happening at a time where we're well aware that rail workers have been banned from sick time or paid time off. And that should be a consideration given in any talk or planning for transport. And that's all I have to say tonight.
Thank you, Lee. I just want to defend Richard. I don't think he meant to sound argumentative. I think he was simply pointing out that we do have the spent fuel pool discharge on our agenda for the next meeting. We've discussed it at previous meetings, but we will go in depth with multiple presentations on the topic at the next meeting. Thank you, Lee, for your comment.
Thank you. Next, we have Susanna Glidden. May I ask Susanna to be unmuted?
Hello, Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. We must have time to process any presentation that the NRC and DOE present about material safety. We also must hear from experts on emergency preparedness and response, medical public health, air monitoring, site contamination, discrete particles, canister cast systems, accessibility and hardened on-site storage, and release of radioactive water. I am very pleased to announce we will hold a forum of outstanding technical experts in mid-February or early March and announce details as soon as available. And may I cede the rest of my time of 2 minutes to Paul Blanche to augment time for his comments tonight. Thank you.
Paul, would you like to take Susanna up on another 2 minutes? You're welcome to the mic.
I appreciate the additional time. And the second issue, the second elephant in the room that no one is addressing is site remediation, which is covered under 10 CFR 2013.01 and Part 20, 2002. And it basically says we can release the site for unrestricted use if the radiation level at waist height is X millirem, I forget what it is. The problem here, and we were in a meeting with the NRC a couple of weeks ago, Michelle Lee and myself, and I said, well, you know, if it's not low enough to meet the requirements, you can just put a little more dirt on top of it. The problem is here with Indian Point, where they're talking about repurposing. There is no limit, and the NRC cannot provide me an answer of what can be buried on the site. For instance, at Maine Yankee and Connecticut Yankee, they have highly radioactive pipes embedded in concrete. And I think this panel, this group, needs to get clarification from the NRC of what will be buried, how many curies or becquerels or microcuries. And what it boils down to, if you're going to bury man-made radioactive material, which they are doing, it becomes a low-level waste site. And if it's a low-level waste site, there are specific requirements. But if you think about repurposing, just ask the NRC what is buried there. And I don't want to, I appreciate all the time you've given me, but on the other issue, I think the panel here has to contact the NRC on that retrievability thing and demand an exemption or a rules change. But thanks very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Next, we have Judy Allen. If we can please unmute Judy Allen.
Yeah. Oh, Judy, I think you need to unmute. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, so I am reading questions that have come in from Jackie Dreschler, who is not able to be here tonight, but she wanted to read these into the record, and we understand that they will not be answered tonight. But anyway, here we go. We would like a radioactive water specialist. Community advocates should be able to use some of the decommissioning funds to hire health experts. We would like a letter of agreement with the NRC that they will never allow Holtec to use decommissioning funds for international or national investments. We would like no waivers on cash checks, no exemptions on dismantling safety standards, for instance, air monitoring for schools and for workers, homeland security, safety, etc. And finally, we would like to know, is the inspector living there yet? And if not, why not? Thank you.
I have to answer the last one. Our inspector doesn't live there, but he does have an office there and is there nearly full-time?
Nearly full-time.
But thank you for the comments, and we will get to those questions with the others before the next meeting. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Diane Turco.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, hi. Hi, I'm Diane Turco. I'm Director of Cape Town Winders. And I'm just sending a message from Pilgrim and the people in Massachusetts. Just quickly, just to answer some of what people have been saying. At Pilgrim, the Holtec has been given exemptions to have emergency planning to the fence for radiological accidents. And then the state has picked up as an all hazards plan, which is inappropriate for a radiological accident. Yucca Mountain is owned by the Shoshone Nation. Consent-based siting, the New Mexican government and the people and citizens rejected Holtec's plan for a CIS, but it's going forward. But I just wanted to warn you folks, Holtec here in Massachusetts is planning to dump over 1 million gallons of radioactive waste into beautiful Cape Cod Bay. The Environmental Protection Agency has already warned Holtec that it is illegal under their NIPD's permit to release that water, and yet Holtec keeps that plan in place. Senator Markey has sent a letter to Holtec and asked them to commit to complying to the EPA regulations, and Holtec still has not done that. So just the other day, the EPA did send a letter to Holtec telling them that there would be fines and perhaps imprisonment if they go through with this plan. So just to let you know, every community from Situate all the way to Provincetown, our legislators, our senators, representatives have all said no dumping in the bay, use a more responsible and legal plan to manage that wastewater. But it is illegal in the state of Massachusetts to dump, but Holtec is still planning to do so. So look at what's happening in Massachusetts, because you folks are just right behind us. And Holtec is not a corporation to be trusted. Thank you for thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Manajo Green.
There. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Manna.
Okay. I have 3 follow-up questions and some information. The first is for the NRC. If the canisters are welded shut, how are the fuel assemblies retrievable if a problem occurs? And that's a follow-up to what Paul Blant said. My second question is, are samples currently being taken for nuclear autopsy to test for embrittlement or other effects of intense exposure to radiation? My third question is, how is scratching to be prevented? These are indeed thin wall canisters. They're 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch. They're essentially a big tin can made of steel, of stainless steel. But how will Holtec prevent scratching when loading? Because scratching can ultimately lead to a through wall leak. And then I was able to send the information that Kelly Turturro presented about the community air monitoring plan to Eric Epstein of 3 Mile Island, who's one of the leading experts probably in the world and certainly in the country on air monitoring. And he sent back a lot of information. We went through that. and I will send it to Kelly to share with the DOB and the committee working on community air monitoring. I am concerned that that there is a difference between emergency preparedness for a nuclear incident versus a pipeline incident, and what would happen if they were concurrent. And with all the discussion, I don't think that question has been answered yet. And lastly, I'll be circulating information from Bob Alvarez, who is one of the leading experts, worked, I believe, for the Department
30 seconds.
Of Energy, and on tritium. It's not something to dismiss easily, and his comments, I think, are really important. And thank you.
Thank you, Manna.
And I will I will email my questions.
Thank you. That would be helpful.
Next, we have Ellen Weininger. Ellen, I believe you may be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity and for this meeting. I want to emphasize the importance of all those topics and issues that need to be addressed, and most especially the importance of medical experts and public health experts as pertains to all of these issues. There has not been anyone invited to the DOB or part of the DOB that has those kinds of qualifications. And I'd like to read a statement from Dr. Ira Helfand, who is the co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility in the United States, and also a 1985 Nobel Peace Prize winner. I have been aware of the extraordinary public health risk posed by the Indian Point nuclear power plant for decades, and was gratified to learn several years ago that the plant was finally being shut down. While aware of the continued dangers to the public that accompany the decommissioning process, I was nonetheless shocked to learn that these dangers are compounded in the case of Indian Point by the co-location of 3 large diameter high pressure natural gas pipelines. Indeed, it is barely credible that these pipelines were ever allowed to pass in such close proximity to the plant. And it is truly incredible that there is a public school less than 400 feet from the pipelines and less than 4,000 feet from the reactor. If this situation were part of the proposed plot line for a grade B movie, it would be dismissed as too unrealistic to be usable. No one would ever allow such an unacceptably dangerous situation. Yet while this arrangement would not pass muster in a movie, it has been allowed to develop at Indian Point. The fact that the current decommissioning work is being allowed to progress without a mandated public health assessment adds to the picture of spectacularly negligent oversight of this extraordinarily hazardous site. The only thing missing is an actual catastrophic accident. So several steps must be taken immediately to try to prevent the disastrous outcome. First, natural gas transmission through the 3 pipelines must be stopped immediately so that the decommissioning can continue without the added risk created by this co-siting. Second, there must be an independent health impact risk assessment and the creation of monitoring, safety, and emergency protocols for the community and nearby school during these decommissioning operations.
30 seconds.
Third, the Buchanan Verplank Elementary School must not be allowed to reopen in September, that's this past September, at the current location until this assessment has been completed, and then only if it is found that it can operate safely as the decommissioning progresses. I hope that New York State will take the necessary steps to protect its citizens from the totally unacceptable risk to public health which has been brought to its attention. Sincerely, Ira Helfand, MD. Thank you so much, and would very much appreciate your urgent attention to this issue of public health by medical experts and public health experts. Thank you very much again.
Thank
Have
you,
a good
Ellen.
Thank you. Next, we have, actually, our final speaker tonight is Susan Leifer.
I guess I'm going to go back over something that's troubling all of us. There's been no real safety assessment of the combination of a rupture from the gas pipeline and its effect on the nuclear material. And there's been no discussion with the public as to what to do. I doubt if the workers who are in charge of our health emergency have any idea what to do. And it seems to be the elephant in the room. And because it's not under one, it's not under the NRC, and it's not under the, it's not under one organization, and we've just avoided connecting it. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our public statement portion of tonight's meeting. Information on other comment opportunities will be provided on a later slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Generally speaking, we try to wrap the meetings by 9. That's in 5 minutes. I'd ask the DOB members if we can stick around a little beyond 9, probably go to 9:10 or so. We have just a few more presentations with updates. I want to thank all of the speakers from the public statement portion of the meeting. As I said, any questions that you raised, we will endeavor to answer before our next meeting and post on our website. You know, there were a few comments regarding the natural gas pipeline, and I would encourage those speakers, if they haven't already done so, to review previous presentations on our website that we've made. We had a guest speaker come, a pipeline expert, discuss ways to mitigate the risks. We appreciate the ongoing concerns in the community. We share those concerns. That's why we take the issue so seriously, and why there are several protocols that we've established to be responsive to that concern. We appreciate the ongoing attention to it, and we will continue to have ongoing attention to it. We do anticipate the federal safety assessment to be released soon. When that is released, obviously we will distribute it, we'll post it on our website, and we will invite the authors to present at a future meeting. But with that being said, let's turn to the next few brief presentations. We do have a few updates that we want to provide to the members and to the public. Next slide, please. Tom Scaglione from ESD is going to give us an overview of cessation mitigation fund activity since, well, for the year. So Tom, could you just give a brief update?
Absolutely, Tom. Good evening, board members and members of the public. So just a quick update on the electric generation facility cessation mitigation program and its associated fund. Some payments, some updated payment amounts here that have taken place over the course of November of this year. As you can see on the slide, Buchanan received its second payment in the amount of $1,095,303. The County of Westchester received its first payment in the amount of $1,201,316, also in November. And the Town of Cortland received its first payment in the amount of $348,240, also in November. And we have reported previously that Hendrick Hudson School District received its first payment in the amount of $6,984,755 in May. Just overall on the fund balance of the $140 million that had been previously authorized, there's approximately $86 million remaining. And also we'll note that we do have, again, new applicants since October 2021, including Tompkins County for the Cayuga facility, Niagara County for the Somerset facility, and the Town of Somerset for the Somerset facility. And that concludes our update.
Thank you, Tom. For our friends at NRC, to the extent that you're in other communities with power plant closures and the concern around lost tax revenue, we're very proud of this one in New York. This is a program that provides 7 years of transitional funding to the taxing jurisdictions to ease the transition and gradually reduce the grants as the tax base adjusts to the loss of revenue from the closed power plant. But Tom, thanks for the update, and it's really great to see the money is flowing to all the affected taxing jurisdictions. Any questions for Tom? Okay, next slide, please. And Sandy, at the last meeting, you had asked for an update on the $15 million Community Environmental Benefits Fund. This was part of the settlement with Entergy closing the plant. $15 million was set aside for the community for environmental and community benefit projects, and to provide an update on the grants that were announced previously, Elise Peterson from NYSERDA. And so you know, NYSERDA is custodian of the funds. The $15 million is in an account managed by NYSERDA, and as the grantees meet their milestones, they are the ones that get to cut the check. So thank you, Elise. Thank you, NYSERDA, for being the custodian of the funds, and thank you for providing us a brief update. Go ahead.
Sure. It's always a good position to be in, to be handing out money. Thank you. Yeah, the slide that we have up provides you with an interim report on the projects that Tom described that have been awarded. There are some formal reporting requirements built into the program, but those won't kick in until next year. So we have this informal report for you now. Awards have been made for the Hudson River Foundation, Teamsters Local 456, Historic Hudson Valley, a combined award for the Village of Buchanan and Town of Cortland, and finally the Hendrick Hudson School District. Looking at the status of each, you see the bullets on the slide, the Hudson River Foundation was awarded $6.5 million to support the continuation of the Hudson River Biological Monitoring Program. Jonathan Kramer, the president and CEO of the Hudson River Foundation, has reported that a work plan has been developed and that this award is expected to support monitoring activities through 2027. Second, the Teamsters Local 456 was awarded $250,000 for the purchase and operation of a commercial driver training simulator to support those members and former plant employees seeking a commercial driver's license. Denise June, training director for the Teamsters Local 456, has reported that numerous students have already been trained or are actively training on that simulator. Next, the Historic Hudson Valley was awarded $750,000 to support historical and environmental integrity improvements to the Van Cortlandt Manor property. Peter Pokris, Senior Vice President at Historic Hudson Valley, has reported that planning is actively progressing and they are on track to put the project out to bid next spring and initiate construction in December of 2023. The Village of Buchanan and Town of Cortland were jointly awarded up to $7 million for intermunicipal projects. Both communities are actively discussing projects at this time. And then finally, $500,000 was awarded to support community monitoring for the benefit of the Hendrick Hudson School District. Dan Bendel with the Department of Environmental Conservation is on the line to provide a brief update on the status of that project. Now, do we want to go to Dan first before taking questions on these?
Let's go to Dan, and then if there are questions, we can take them. Go ahead, Dan. Next slide, please. Dan Bendel, are you with us?
Yes, I am. I'm trying to see the slide.
Okay, yep. There you are. We hear you.
Okay. Good evening, Dan Bendel with New York State DEC. So as part of, as they said, we're working with the DOP to do a work group for the community air monitoring plan. And we've been working with the Department of Health and other New York State experts to develop an RFP for this plan, which I believe we're on schedule to have out before the end of December this month. And we've already gone through some versions of it. And where the technical experts from both the Department of Health and the DEC combined to put this together, and it's now in the DPSs with the public service to go out for proposals.
Thank you, Dan, very much. Questions for Elise, Dan, or any of us on the status project? Sandy?
Well, I guess I'm concerned about the $7 million for Buchanan and Cortland, that there doesn't seem to be any progress or, on that chart. And I'm just wondering if maybe another proposal might be accepted for that amount of money. Isn't that the largest disbursement of dollars?
Yeah, so on the 7 million, that is targeted, we say intermunicipal projects. What we're specifically referring to is sewer infrastructure projects, which we are excited about. We think that there's a number of benefits associated with doing sewer projects. Obviously, environmental benefits to the river, economic benefits to the town, and there's real taxpayer benefits as well, because the village is on the hook to do significant upgrades at their sewage treatment facility, which without this grant would be costs would be borne by their taxpayers. So we're still hopeful that the intermunicipal agreements can be reached between the town and the village, and I'm encouraged that I understand discussions are still underway. So I don't think, Sandy, to answer your question, that that we need to go to alternatives, but if agreement isn't reached and the town and the village choose not to pursue the joint sewage projects, then yes, we would have to find alternatives. I don't know if
Is there a time frame? Could we try to stay within the next 2 months?
Rich, do you want to talk to that?
Sure. We have a preliminary document that was drawn up by the Village of Buchanan, and we are trying to negotiate it. I believe we've made some good progress recently. The plant belongs to Buchanan. They're very protective of it and in an understandable way. And we're trying to reach an agreement that will allow the first portion of the funds to go for the rehab of the program to bring the plant to bring it into compliance. The second portion of funds would go to the expansion of the plant so that they can accept the additional capacity. And the third portion would go to put the sewer pipes in that would allow the town of Portland to connect into it. So we tentatively have scheduled on our follow-up meeting. We met here about 2 weeks ago, and we have another meeting scheduled a week from Monday. I think it's the 19th. So I'll keep you posted.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Rich. We had been joined earlier by Mayor Knickerbocker. I'm not sure if she's still on, wants to weigh in on this issue at all. I don't think we still have her, but I know she shares the sentiment that there are fruitful discussions still underway. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay. As we did for 2022, and at the request of many members of the community, we'd like to proceed with publishing our meeting schedule for 2023. Tom Kazmarek has reached out to all the DOB members and solicited feedback on this schedule. It seems to be the consensus, so we will be posting this on our website. The next meeting will be on February 2nd. And as we've discussed earlier, the main topic will be spent fuel pool water removal. All the meetings will take place here at Cortland Town Hall, generally at the same time, 6 to 9. So with that, please go to the next slide, unless there are any questions on the schedule. Okay. Another quick announcement. Many of you know Dave Lochbaum, our independent nuclear expert, has been extremely generous with his time. He's a volunteer. Any question that comes up of a technical nature, he is quick to respond to, and members of the DOB often receive slide decks from Dave, even when no one has asked him for a slide deck that seems a question is out there. He knows it will be of interest to us, and he puts some really incredible information together for us, and we are really greatly appreciative of that. And we want to share that with the world. So we asked Dave if he'd mind if we posted his work that he's been doing behind the scenes for the DOB on our website. We will be dedicating a portion of our website to Dave Lockbaum's research and presentations that he has provided to the DOB, and I think members of the public will find it very, very educational. Dave, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about this, but we're excited to present this.
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate the arrangement to do that. I also appreciate the fact that there's a disclaimer on that page saying that the materials present my views and opinions, not necessarily those of the DOB or New York State or the Joint Task Force. They're my views. Any opinions are mine, and any mistakes are mine as well.
Well, we are very grateful and appreciate all the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. Want to just remind the public that in addition to the public statement portion, there are opportunities to comment at any time on our website. These are the instructions how to go there. Next slide, please. This is an important thing I don't think enough members of the community take advantage of. There's an opportunity to subscribe to our proceeding, essentially, which means that anytime new documents get posted into our document management system, there could be an email alert. So when there are meetings, you'll get the meeting notices. When there are new documents posted, there's correspondence, maybe from agencies on the DOB to the NRC. There's an opportunity for you to be notified that those documents have been entered into our website, and you can stay up to date on those kinds of things. When the video broadcast of these meetings gets posted, the archives, when it gets posted, a notification will go out. But you need to subscribe. And so we really encourage members of the public to go through the steps on our website to subscribe to our service list. And that will provide you with those notifications so that you can stay up to date and see all the information that is flowing through the DOB. Next slide, please. Again, another very good recommendation from the community was to create a website that is a little easier to navigate than our regulatory website at the DPS. We did that. It's within the DPS website, but it's dedicated to Indian Point. The address is on this slide, dps.ny.gov/Indian Point. You'll find there all of the decommissioning updates, our schedule for the meetings, links to the document library that I was just referring to. There are notifications for when federal comments are due. When we post answers to all of your questions that we hear at these meetings, it's available. We post them on this website. And as I just mentioned, Dave Lockbaum's work will also be available. Next slide, please. The Indian Point tip line, I want to just remind the workers at Holtec, you see something, say something. We obviously are here to ensure public safety is protected. We care about the workers as well. And if the workers there who are doing all of the amazing work to continue to make the site safer every single day see concerns, we want you to know that we have a whistleblower process. You can call us at this number, 518-486-1487. You can email tips to us at ip.tips@dps.ny.gov. And Tom, next slide. As I said, next slide. Next meeting is February 2nd. And before I adjourn, I also want to acknowledge that Sandy Galiff is retiring. This is her last meeting with us. Sandy has been just an incredible partner, and it is really thanks to Sandy that this whole body exists. Sandy introduced the legislation to create the Indian Point Closure Task Force. She introduced the legislation that would have created the Decommissioning Oversight Board. You typically, as a head of an agency, we can sometimes get annoyed with a lot of legislation telling the agency what it should or shouldn't do. In this case, we really welcomed it. It was a good idea. It's been a great success, in my opinion. Of course, we've had some bumps in the road, but with your leadership, working with the community, we've been listening to what the host community needs. We brought state government to the local community, and it's really due to your tireless efforts. And we greatly appreciate you. We will miss you dearly, and we've put together a certificate of appreciation for Cindy Galiff.
Maybe the NRC sometime. No. Anyway, I really want to thank Tom and the Decommissioning Oversight Board is terrific. And it wasn't just me. It was, you have to remember, Pete Harcum,
yes,
my pal, right, Tito? We had the legislation, but we worked with so many people that are in this community that are sitting here today on that legislation. It didn't it changed, every week. We never knew whether it was going to happen, and we were so excited when Andrew Cuomo, as governor, really picked up on it and said, this is a good idea, and then we have what we have today. And it's just really been, I think every meeting is so informative, so involving. I think we've made a lot of progress, and it will go on for a long time. I don't think there's an end to this DOB, is there? until
your statute sunsets on the Indian Point Task Force. Not that I'm, looking forward to that day. But
thank you all so very much. It's just really been a pleasure, and I will track you all as you go forward with all these other issues.
Thank you, Sandy. So thank you all very much. I'm sorry, Richard?
Just have one last thing.
Yes, sure.
Which I don't want to, just in case we get accused of not doing things, right, is that, first of all, obviously, let's thank Sandy again, because, if it wasn't for Sandy and Pete Harcum, who actually picked up on the community ideas, it wouldn't have happened. But of course, if the community hadn't had the ideas in the first place, it wouldn't have happened. Right. And if the governor hadn't picked up, so there's a lot of steps along the way, but it's great that it happened. And, I hope that it's not just the members of the task force that think it's a good thing. At least, information's getting out there. We are developing some solutions. The situation, I hope most people believe is better than it would have been without the task force. Mm-hmm. That said, there was a violation, an NRC violation, that Holtec received in the last quarter, I believe, since the last meeting, about the negative pressure on the containment. And I don't think we want to deal with it tonight, but I want to acknowledge it and say we're concerned about it. These violations should not happen. I think I want to go into detail on this and understand why it happened and make sure that these violations won't be repeated, not just for the containment, but for other systems.
Richard, I think, thank you for raising it. And I failed to mention that typically with our meetings, it's routine for us to have a presentation by Holtec and by the agency oversight entities to discuss activities since the last meeting. In the interest of time, because we had so many presentations, we didn't do that at this time. We did circulate presentations by both Holtec and the state agencies to the DOB members. They're posted on our website. But you're absolutely correct. There was a violation. We should discuss that at the next meeting in more depth than we have time for tonight. And we will do that. So thank you for raising it. With that, I think we should adjourn. I appreciate everyone's attendance and participation and engagement. Thank you.